Bedtime Reading. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. Chapter 1. Aunt Polly Keeps Her Promise. Tom! Tom! There was no reply. Now where could that boy be? The old woman said as she looked around the room. You had better hope I don't find you, because when I do... Without finishing her sentence, she searched the room and found only the cat under the bed. Then she thought he might be in the garden. Looking out of the window, she shouted, "Thomas Sawyer!" And suddenly she heard something behind her. Quickly turning around, she was just in time to catch a young boy trying to run out of the room. "What were you doing just now? Why didn't you come when you heard me calling you?"
I wasn't doing anything. Really, I wasn't.
Well, how can I believe that when all I have to do is to look at you and see your dirty hands and face? How did you get so dirty?
I don't know, Aunt Polly.
Well, I know. You've been eating junk food again, haven't you? How many times have I had to tell you not to eat sweets? She raised her hand to hit Tom, but just before she brought it down on him, he shouted,
"Hey, there's something behind you!"
And when his aunt turned to look, he ran away as fast as he could out of the house and quickly disappeared from Aunt Polly's sight. Even though she had been so angry with Tom, she couldn't help laughing and saying to herself, "That boy! He's always getting into trouble. I hate to punish him so often, and I really hate to hit him, but sometimes there's nothing else an old woman can do. He doesn't like to work, and he doesn't like to go to school. He doesn't like to do anything but play. But I promised my sister before she died that I would take care of her son and make sure he grows up to be a good man, and I plan to keep that promise. If I find out he hasn't gone to school today, I'll make him work all day Saturday." Of course, Tom did not go to school that day. He played down by the river instead. Later that evening, when he returned home late, his brother, Sid, was finishing his housework. Tom liked Sid, but hated that he was always being a good boy and trying to please Aunt Polly. Sid didn't know how to have fun like Tom did. He was boring. After doing his own housework, Tom sat down to eat. During the meal, his Aunt Polly began to ask questions about his afternoon at school. "Tom, did you bring home any books to study?"
"Yes, Aunt Polly."
"Oh, good. And tell me, did you go swimming today, Tom?" Hearing this, Tom started to fear that she knew about his afternoon.
"No, Aunt Polly. Why do you ask?"
She put her hand on his shirt. Luckily, it was dry, but Tom knew his pants were still wet, and before she could touch them, he quickly said,
"Because of the hot weather, some of us poured water on our heads, to keep cool."
Aunt Polly believed him and was happy to hear he'd been so good. Later that evening, as Tom was out walking and enjoying the warm summer air, he met a stranger. It was a boy, a tall boy, taller than Tom. And he was dressed well, wearing what seemed to be new clothing. He even wore shoes. Tom suddenly felt a little embarrassed about his own clothing. Neither boy spoke. They simply stared at each other and began to walk in a circle, never looking away from the other's face. Tom felt he had to teach this boy a lesson, so he said,
"I could make you cry." "No, you couldn't." "Couldn't." Could. Okay, try.
Tom just looked at him silently for a moment and then said,
I could make you cry like a little girl. Then do it. You think you're so strong. I am. I'm so strong I could beat you with one hand tied behind my back. I'm waiting for you to stop talking and start fighting. I think you're afraid. I'm not. You are. I'm not. You are.
They began to push each other with their shoulders, again moving in a circle. And then, suddenly, they were fighting on the ground, hitting and kicking each other, and pulling hair. But soon, Tom was on top of the new boy, hitting him with his fists.
Have you had enough?
He asked. The boy tried to get away. He was crying angrily.
Have you had enough?
Then the new boy said,
Okay, stop.
Tom got off of him and started to walk away, but as soon as he turned, the boy threw a rock and hit Tom in the back. The boy ran away, but Tom followed him home and waited until the boy's mother came out and yelled at Tom to go away. When Tom arrived at his home, he had to enter through his bedroom window because he was late and he didn't want his Aunt Polly to see him. But his aunt was waiting for him. Sid had told her about Tom's afternoon, and when she saw from his clothes that he'd been fighting, she started to plan all the work Tom would do on Saturday. Chapter 2. Tom learns a lesson about desire. Saturday morning came, and, like all Saturdays, it was bright and sunny. Perfect for going out to play. But Tom had other plans. He was to paint his aunt's fence. Just looking at all the work he had to do made him feel sad. The fence was huge in his eyes. It would take him all day to finish the work. He slowly began by wetting his brush and started moving it along one of the wooden boards. After doing this for a while, he became very bored. And just as he was about to give up, Jim, a boy who worked for the family, came through the gate. He was going to get water. Tom stopped him.
Hey, Jim, why don't you paint and I'll get the water?
Jim said,
No, I can't do that. Oh, don't worry about Aunt Polly. She won't hurt you. I'll give you one of my toys, and I'll show you where I hurt my foot.
Jim took the toy and looked at Tom's foot, but just at that moment, Aunt Polly was returning home. Jim ran off and Tom tried to look busy by painting as fast as possible. But soon, his hands started to move slower and slower as he thought about all of the fun he could be having if he weren't working. He knew that his friends would walk by soon and laugh at him. He wished that he had enough money to pay other boys to come and do the work for him, but he had nothing. Then, suddenly, he had a great idea, and he began to work again. The first of his friends to walk by was Ben Rogers. He was eating an apple and pretending to be a riverboat, imitating all kinds of riverboat sounds. A bell.
Ding, ding, ding.
A riverboat worker.
Okay, boys, it's time to slow her down. We're getting near land. Easy now. Turn her slowly.
He shouted.
Slow down. Okay, boys, and stop.
He turned himself and came slowly to a stop near Tom. Tom didn't pay any attention to the boat. He pretended to be interested in his work.
Hi, Tom. Did you get into trouble?
Tom didn't reply. He just kept moving his brush up and down the board.
Do you have to work all day?
Tom turned suddenly.
Oh, hi there, Ben. I didn't see you. I'm going swimming. It's too bad you can't go. You have to work.
Tom looked at him strangely.
Work? What work?
What you're doing now looks a lot like work. Hard work,
Ben said, pointing to the fence. Tom returned to his painting.
Oh, this? Well, I guess what's work for you is fun for Tom Sawyer. Are you saying that you like this? Do I like it? I love it. I wish I could do this more often.
Ben seemed surprised to hear this. He watched Tom for a little while. Tom pretended to be doing a very careful job, painting a little, then stepping back to look at what he had done to make sure it looked okay, making a few corrections and then continuing to the next board. The more Ben watched, the more interested he became.
Tom, let me paint a little.
Tom thought for a moment and then said,
Sorry, Ben. This fence has to be painted perfectly. It takes a special person to do it well. Please, Tom, let me try. I'll give you part of my apple. No, Ben. I'm sorry, but... Okay, you can have the whole apple.
Hearing this, Tom gladly traded Ben the brush for the apple and sat down under a tree to think of other ways to get more help. Soon, Tom had more and more boys painting for him. They had laughed when they first saw Ben painting, but soon realized how excited he was to be doing the work. So they became equally as excited and were soon asking Tom for a brush. But Tom had said no until they started to offer to pay him. At the end of the day, he had been given a cat with one eye, a piece of broken glass, different kinds of toys, and many other things. Tom was rich. Soon the fence was finished, and Tom had painted none of it himself. This made him realize something very useful in life. Men will desire anything they think they can't easily have. Chapter 3. Tom in the Army. A new love is discovered. When Tom went to tell Aunt Polly he had finished the work, she was sitting beside an open window, half asleep and holding a cat. She was surprised to see him. She thought he had given up hours ago. "You've already finished. How is that possible?"
Really, Auntie, it's all done.
She went to look at the fence, and seeing that he had told her the truth, she said, "Well now, you're a hard worker when you want to be, Tom Sawyer. You can go play now, but come home early. And you can take an apple with you if you want." Tom ran into the kitchen and, after looking at the apple for a moment, picked up a piece of cake instead and ran out to look for his friends. Tom found them getting ready to play war, and they chose Tom to be the leader of one of the armies. His friend, Joe Harper, was the leader of the other army. When the battle began, Tom and Joe sat under a tree and shouted commands to their soldiers. It was a bloody battle, and like most wars, no army was a clear winner. But the boys enjoyed themselves and agreed to meet again another day for more fighting. On his way home, Tom passed Jeff Thatcher's house, and there he saw, for the first time, a beautiful blue-eyed and yellow-haired girl playing in the garden. Love was not a new feeling for Tom. Last week, he had been in love with a girl named Amy Lawrence, but now she had been totally replaced by this new girl. He couldn't stop watching her as she played, but suddenly he saw that she was looking at him and he pretended that he hadn't noticed her. He tried to seem cool, walking on his hands, jumping and running about. But she lost interest and started to walk toward the house. Tom suddenly became sad, but was quickly made happy again when he saw her throw a flower over the fence. Tom slowly walked over to where the flower was, looked around, and, after seeing that no one was looking, picked it up and put it under his shirt, next to his heart. He went home feeling excited. His aunt wondered what he could be so happy about. She hoped that it wasn't anything he could get into trouble for. Unfortunately, later that evening, his brother Sid took some sweets, but his aunt thought Tom had taken them, so she hit Tom instead of Sid. And later, when she discovered that she was wrong, she didn't apologize to Tom. This made him feel very sad. He wished he would die, so she would feel sorry. He liked the idea of her crying over his dead body. So he left his home and went down to the river. Looking at the water, he wondered if it would hurt to drown. Then he remembered his flower and took it from under his shirt. He wondered how the new girl would feel if he died. Would she cry, or would she just continue to play in her garden, as if nothing happened? The idea seemed bittersweet to him. He thought about it for a while and then started to walk back home. He stopped near the Thatcher house. Was that room with the light on her room? He sat under the window and imagined laying down and dying right there and her finding his body the next morning. And in the middle of this thought, the window above him suddenly opened. He could hear the housekeeper talking to someone, and then he felt water being poured from the window on top of him. Tom jumped up and ran. He was terribly wet. And when his brother, Sid, saw him enter through the bedroom window, he didn't say anything because of Tom's angry face. But he planned to tell his aunt all about it the next morning. Chapter 4. Sunday Classes at the Church. The sun rose over a quiet world and looked warmly down upon the peaceful village. That morning, all of the families began their day by praying together. After saying his morning prayers with his family, Tom studied the Bible, because today he had to go to Sunday school. Tom was trying to remember 5 of the shortest sentences in the book, so he could say them in class. And, with help from Aunt Polly's daughter, Mary, he soon learned them. After this, she helped him to put on his nice Sunday clothes. He was disappointed that she made him wear shoes. He hated shoes. And he hated his church lessons, but Mary and Sid loved them. When he came to the church entrance, he saw a friend there and asked him,
"Billy, do you have a yellow ticket?" "Yes." "I'll buy it from you." "How much will you pay?"
Billy accepted Tom's offer and gave him the ticket. And for the next 10 minutes, Tom bought more and more tickets, some blue, some red, from other boys he met at the door. Children were given tickets for learning Bible sentences. Blue meant that 2 sentences had been learned, red meant 20, and yellow meant 200. If a student had 10 yellow tickets, he would win a Bible. It was a great honor to win this. Although Tom didn't really care about having a new Bible, he loved the idea of being the only student to get it. At the beginning of class, the teacher told the children to be good, sit up straight, and listen carefully. Tom noticed 3 men and a woman enter the classroom while the teacher was talking. The woman had a child with her. It was the new girl whom he had seen the other day. He wanted her to see him, so he started to hit and play with his friends sitting near him. The teacher asked the 5 new people to come to the front of the class and then introduced them to the students. Everyone knew the first man, Mr. Thatcher, because he was from the same village, but the other gentleman was his brother, Judge Thatcher. He had just moved to this village with his family, and he was a very interesting man who had traveled to many different parts of the world. That day, in order to impress Judge Thatcher, the teacher hoped a student would come to class with 10 yellow tickets. But, of course, this was not something that happened often. He didn't really expect this to happen. He just hoped he might be lucky. Looking around the room, he saw that none of the students had enough tickets. He became disappointed. But then, Tom Sawyer approached him holding 9 yellow tickets, 9 red tickets, and 10 blue tickets. The teacher's dream had come true. And it was even more surprising that it was Tom Sawyer who had them. He never expected Tom to learn more than 10 sentences in his whole life. The boys who had sold their tickets to Tom felt terribly jealous now. They wished they had kept them. They had been tricked by Tom so many times that the only thing they could feel now was anger. Tom felt proud standing next to the judge. He was also very nervous. Not because the judge was a great man, but because he was the father of that beautiful blue-eyed and yellow-haired girl. The judge then spoke to him.
"What's your name, son?" "Tom." "But don't you have another name, a last name?" "Tell the gentleman your full name, Thomas,"
said the teacher.
"Thomas Sawyer. You must be a fine young man for learning so many sentences. Those sentences will be useful for you for the rest of your life. By learning more and more, you'll one day become a great man, son. And then you can remember this day, and you'll be so happy that you attended your church lessons. Now, Thomas, share with us some of the things you've learned from your study of the Bible. For instance, tell us the names of the first 2 followers of Jesus Christ."
Tom suddenly became frightened and embarrassed. He looked at his feet. The teacher knew that Tom had not really learned all of those sentences, but asked Tom to answer the judge's question anyway.
"Answer the gentleman, Thomas. Don't be afraid."
Tom remained silent. "You can tell me," said the lady. "The names of the first 2 followers of Jesus Christ were—" Tom thought of 2 names from the book. He wasn't sure who they were or what they had done, but he knew that they were very popular names and that the names always appeared together.
"David and Goliath."
This, of course, was terribly wrong, because although David and Goliath were from the Bible, they hadn't been followers of Jesus Christ. David was a young boy, and Goliath was a huge man of very great size and strength. But when they fought, even though David was much smaller, he managed to kill Goliath. Let us move on to the next part of the story in order to save Tom from further embarrassment. Chapter 5. The Church Service. At 9 o'clock that morning, the church bell began to ring, which meant that it was time for everyone to gather to hear the minister, Mr. Sprague, speak. The Sunday school children would all join their families to listen to him. And it was always the same, that while he spoke to the village people and led them in prayer, the parents would quietly try to keep their children from behaving badly. Of course, Sid and Mary enjoyed listening to Mr. Sprague, so Aunt Polly never had trouble with them in church. But Tom would always have to be seated far away from the window, so he wouldn't spend the whole time looking outside. The whole village was slowly entering the church and taking their seats. The young, the middle-aged, the old, the rich, and the poor. Everyone was there, including Mrs. Douglas, who lived alone in the big house on Cardiff Hill. She was one of the richest people in the village. Even though she smiled and was generally a very kind person, Tom always thought she looked lonely since her husband died a few years ago. All of the children were wearing their best clothing, and the pretty young girls all looked prettier than usual, which also kept the boys from paying attention to Mr. Sprague. All of the boys except for Willie Mufferson, who was always well behaved. None of the children liked him, but he was a favorite among the adults. Everyone now became quiet at the sound of the bell ringing again. It was time for Mr. Sprague to begin. As usual, they started by singing a little. Then this would be followed by meeting announcements for the week. And finally, they would say many prayers. Prayers for the church, for the people of the village, for the village itself, for America, and for people in countries all over the world. Tom was bored, and it took all of his strength to keep from falling asleep. He decided to concentrate on an insect that landed on the seat in front of him. It started to slowly and carefully clean itself with its legs. Tom couldn't understand this, because he didn't like to clean himself so carefully. He was always in a hurry to play. He wanted to pick the insect up, but knew that his aunt would punish him if he did this during Mr. Sprague's prayer. But as his prayer came closer and closer to ending, Tom's hand moved closer and closer toward the insect. And at the last word, Tom put it between his hands. However, Aunt Polly made him set it free. But church didn't end there. Mr. Sprague began to talk about something else Tom couldn't understand. The minister mostly read from a book, and the only thing Tom could ever remember from the book was how many pages had been read. But this morning was different. Mr. Sprague spoke about his hopes for the world in the future. He hoped for world peace, where all nations, both rich and poor, strong and weak, would join together in friendship. This was interesting to Tom. He imagined the strong countries as wild animals and the weak countries as farm animals. He imagined himself playing with all of these animals together, without any fear. And he found himself agreeing strongly with Mr. Sprague's wishes for the future of the world. But soon the minister began to talk about other things that were very uninteresting to Tom. He tried to listen, but his thoughts would easily wander to some other idea, such as the things he had in his pocket. He remembered that he had a little box with an insect inside. He took it out to play with it, but the first thing the insect did was bite Tom on the finger. Tom dropped it on the floor, and it landed on its back. Tom noticed that it couldn't get back on its feet. He wanted to help it, but it was too far away, and his aunt would get angry with him if he didn't pay full attention to the minister. Suddenly, Tom saw a dog come into the church. The dog looked just as bored as Tom. He too wanted something fun to do. He saw the insect on the floor and became excited. He decided to play with it. He walked in a circle around the insect and made little noises at it. Then he tried to smell the insect by putting his nose near it. And just like Tom's finger, the insect bit the dog on the nose. The dog cried out in pain and ran away from the insect. Everyone who had seen what happened laughed at the dog's foolishness. The dog was angry and embarrassed, and he went back to the insect and made angry sounds at it this time. But after a while he became bored again and found a piece of paper on the ground, which he started to play with. He did this for a few minutes and then got tired. He decided to lie down for a while, but having forgotten the insect, he sat down on top of it. A few seconds later, he was running around the church and crying out in pain. His owner quickly put the dog outside and took his seat again, silently begging the minister's pardon. Tom could still hear the dog crying outside as it ran away from the church. Mr. Sprague was upset about being interrupted. He angrily waited for everyone to stop laughing. It took a long time before everyone was quiet again. But soon, Mr. Sprague continued with his prayer. Every once in a while, laughing could be heard, but the minister did his best not to pay attention to it. The people were happy to find that he only had a few more things to say, because they were ready for church to be over, so they could enjoy the rest of their Sunday. Tom left the church feeling very satisfied. He thought he wouldn't mind going there if it would be this interesting every Sunday. The only thing he wasn't happy about was having his insect stolen by that silly dog. Chapter 6. A Conversation About Spirits. Tom hated Mondays. Monday always meant the beginning of a new school week. This made him hate weekends, too, because they were so enjoyable that they made the weekdays even more boring. He thought that if he had to sit through school today, it might kill him. Then he had the idea that he could stay home if he were ill. But he didn't really feel ill. He tried to concentrate on different parts of his body to see if they felt bad, but no matter how hard he thought about it, he seemed to feel perfectly fine. Then he remembered his foot, and this gave him the idea to start crying in pain. He cried loudly, but his brother Sid didn't seem to hear him. He just continued sleeping. Tom cried louder and louder. He cried so much that he actually started to believe that his foot really hurt, but still, Sid didn't seem to notice.
Oh, Sid, help me, Sid,
Tom cried. Sid still didn't move, so Tom picked up a book and threw it at him. Sid sat up, saying,
"Hey, what's wrong?"
Now Tom pretended not to hear him. Sid started to push Tom to get him to answer. Tom said,
"Oh, don't do that, Sid, it hurts. I'll go and get Aunt Polly." "No, Sid, don't do that,"
Tom said as he pretended to cry.
"I want you to know that when I'm dead, I won't be angry with you for all those times you got me into trouble with Aunt Polly." "You mean you're dying, Tom?" "I'm leaving everything valuable I have to that new girl. Be sure that she gets all of it, Sid."
But Sid didn't hear Tom now, for he had run to his aunt, yelling,
Tom's dying! Tom's dying!"
Aunt Polly came running into Tom's room, her face looking very frightened. She touched his head and cried to him, "Tell me what's wrong, Tom. Tell your aunt where it hurts."
"It's my foot, Auntie. I think the doctor will have to cut it off."
Aunt Polly suddenly stopped crying and just stared at Tom for a moment. Then she fell back into a chair and started laughing and crying at the same time. Once she had gotten control of herself again, she said, "Tom, you get out of bed and get ready for school." This helped Tom to remember that he wasn't really in pain, and he jumped out of bed and ran to get dressed. On his way to school, Tom saw his friend Huckleberry Finn. Huckleberry had a bad family. His father always drank too much, and his parents were always fighting with each other. So Huckleberry had run away from home, and for this reason, many of the adults in the village thought he was a bad child. But the children thought of him differently. They liked him, and they wished that they could be like him and be as free as he was to do anything he wanted, for he didn't go to school or church. Instead, he would just play or go swimming or fishing. Because he didn't live with his parents anymore, Huckleberry's clothing was often in very poor condition. They were always dirty and either too big or too small for him. He was always the first to wear no shoes in the summer and the last to put them on in the winter. And Huckleberry almost never washed himself. Tom liked Huck a lot, and because the adults disliked Huckleberry so much, Tom played with him as often as he could.
"Hello there, Huckleberry,"
said Tom.
Yeah, hello,"
replied Huckleberry.
"What do you have there in that bag?" "It's a dead cat." "Wow, Huck. Will you let me see him? Where did you get it?" "A boy gave it to me." "What do you plan to do with a dead cat, Huck?" "I'm going to use it to take off these warts."
Huckleberry showed Tom the ugly spots on his hands.
"But how can a dead cat remove warts?" "After someone dies and their body is put in the ground, you take your cat to that person's grave just before 12 o'clock midnight. After 12 o'clock, you will start to hear a low sound, something like the wind, or you might even hear someone talking very softly. These are terrible spirits that have come to carry the dead man away. You won't be able to see them, but you can hear them. And when they start to leave with the body, you throw the cat at them and say, 'Spirits, follow body. Cat follows spirits. Warts follow cat.' I promise you that will take away anyone's warts." "Have you ever done it before?" "Not yet. But you remember that old Hoss Williams just died, right?" "Yes, I remember, Huck. But they put him in the ground on Saturday. The spirits have already taken his body." "Now, think for a minute. If he was buried on Saturday, the spirits couldn't have taken him away at 12 o'clock because it would be Sunday at that time. Bad spirits don't dare do anything on Sunday. That's God's day. So I'm thinking they'll come tonight." "You know, you're right. So can I come with you?" "Are you sure you won't be too frightened?" "Of course not. Come and get me at my house tonight. Make a sound like a cat, and I'll come out to meet you." "Yes, but you answer this time, because the last time I did that you never answered, and one of your neighbors started throwing rocks at me." I'm sorry, Huck. My aunt was keeping her eye on me that night. There was nothing I could do. But tonight, I promise there won't be a problem.
Tom was excited about this evening. Now he had something to think about during his boring class. As soon as he walked into the classroom, the teacher yelled out his name.
Thomas Sawyer.
He knew he was in trouble whenever someone called him by his full name. He didn't look at the teacher, but walked directly to his desk and took a seat.
Thomas Sawyer, what's your excuse for being late this time?
Before he answered, Tom saw the new girl sitting with the other girls. He noticed that the chair next to hers was empty. Seeing this, he got an idea and shouted out so everyone could hear it clearly.
I met Huckleberry Finn on my way to school, and we had a nice long talk.
This was a good way to get into trouble, because, like all the other adults, Tom's teacher didn't like Huckleberry Finn. None of the students could understand why Tom had admitted this. Any excuse would be better than this one.
I've told you 100 times never to speak with that boy. I'll have to make sure you remember it next time. Come here and take off your coat.
Tom knew what was going to happen. The teacher collected sticks that he found useful for hitting his students with as punishment for their bad behavior. Most of his supply had been used to beat Tom. After he'd finished beating him, the teacher said,
Maybe that will help you to remember. Now, go and sit with the girls.
Happily, Tom went over and sat next to the new girl. She tried not to look at him and turned to talk to a girl behind her. When she turned back around to face the front of the room, she found an apple sitting on her desk. She pushed it away, but Tom moved it back toward her, and when she tried to push it away again, he didn't let her. Then, Tom took out a piece of paper and started to write something on it. He covered it with his hands so she couldn't see what he was doing. "What are you doing there?" asked the girl. Tom finished and showed her that he'd drawn a house. It was a terrible drawing, but the girl seemed to like it anyway. "Great! Now draw a man for me." Tom did what he was told, but he also drew a woman next to the man. "It's wonderful," said the girl. "I wish I could draw like that."
Okay, I'll teach you how to draw during lunch. Or are you going back home?
asked Tom. "I'll stay if you'll really teach me."
Okay, but what's your name?
Becky Thatcher. What's your... Oh, of course, I know your name. You're Tom Sawyer.
You can just call me Tom.
As he said this, he took out another piece of paper and started to write something, but again he didn't let Becky see. "Now what are you doing?"
Nothing, really.
"Oh, please let me see it."
If I show, do you promise not to tell the teacher?
"I promise." Becky quickly took the paper from Tom and read the words, "I love you." "Oh, you're such a bad boy," she said, hitting him gently on the head, but she was smiling a very big smile. Tom smiled back, but suddenly he felt someone take hold of his ear and pull him up from his chair.
You should go sit with the boys now, young man,
said the teacher as he moved Tom back toward his other seat. And even though the whole class laughed at Tom, he felt nothing but happiness in his heart. Chapter 7. Tom Gets Engaged. At lunchtime, after the teacher had left the classroom, Tom went to sit with Becky and taught her how to draw. They drew only for a little while, and then started talking instead.
Tell me, Becky, have you ever promised to marry a boy before?
No, of course not.
Would you like to promise to marry someone?
Maybe, but I don't know how.
It's easy. You just agree to marry the boy, kiss him, and that's it.
Kiss? What for?
It's just what people do. Do you remember what I wrote?
Yes.
What did I write? If you don't, I can say it again.
Becky just laughed and said, "Not now."
But I want to say it now. Okay, I'll say it quietly in your ear.
He put his mouth close to her ear and whispered the words. Then he sat back and said,
Do you want to say it to me?
She became embarrassed and asked him to look the other way. Then she put her hand to his ear and whispered the same words, "I love you," and ran away from him. He started to try to catch her as she ran between the tables and chairs in the classroom. Finally, he caught her, but she covered her face with her hands. Tom waited patiently for her to remove her hands, and when she eventually did, he kissed her and said,
Now you've promised to marry me. You can never love another boy.
"Okay, and you can never marry another girl."
Of course. I'll love and marry only you, and we'll play together every day.
"I think I like this kind of promise. What do you call it?"
It's called getting engaged. I like it too. I and Amy Lawrence were...
But Tom stopped when he saw Becky's eyes get bigger. She was clearly not happy anymore. "You mean you've been engaged to other girls before?" Becky cried.
Oh, well, I never did marry Amy, and I don't love her anymore.
Seeing that she didn't seem to feel better, Tom took a gold-colored ball from his pocket and tried to give it to her. She took it and threw it on the ground. Tom felt both hurt and angry. He walked out of the school and into the forest, and he planned to stay there for the rest of the day. Becky thought that he would come back a few minutes later, but when he didn't, she started to call out for him. "Tom, where did you go? Please come back." When no reply came, she started to cry even harder than before. Chapter 8. Tom makes a decision. Tom walked far into the forest. He was even further than Mrs. Douglas's house on Cardiff Hill. He decided to rest under a tree and think for a bit. He again wished that he could die. But this idea was soon replaced with the desire to live. There were so many places he could travel to in the world, so many things he could do. He could be a soldier, he could join the Indians, or even better, he could become a pirate and steal money and treasure from people traveling on the sea. He'd be good at that. He'd probably become famous for it too. Then, how would Becky feel about him? She would wish that she had been nicer to him when she had the chance. He decided that he would leave the next morning to begin his life as Tom Sawyer the pirate. Suddenly, he heard someone calling out in the forest. He quickly ran to his secret hiding place, where he kept a lot of toys hidden. He found his wooden knife and put it between his pants and his belt. He was now the famous Robin Hood, friend of the poor and enemy of the rich, who had lived over 100 years ago with his army of robbers. Moving quietly and carefully from tree to tree, he told his men to stay where they were. And then his friend Joe Harper came from behind another tree. Tom shouted to him,
"Stop there, stranger! Why have you entered my forest without permission?" "I am Guy of Gisborne,"
replied Joe.
"I go wherever I want to go. Who do you think you are?" "I am the famous Robin Hood, who shall kill you if you don't start behaving friendlier." "If you really are Robin Hood, I'll gladly fight you so that I may become famous for killing you."
They started to pretend to fight. But after a while, Tom became tired and shouted to Joe,
"Let me kill you. You have to. I don't want to die, and I'm stronger than you. Let me kill you." "But that's not in the story. Robin Hood never dies in the story." "Okay, fine."
Joe turned around and let Tom kill him.
"Now, you can be Robin Hood for a while, Joe. Then you can kill me."
Joe liked this idea and happily started to fight Tom again. Soon, Tom was on the ground, pretending to bleed terribly. Joe told him he'd done a good job at dying and that he should be an actor when he grew up. Tom said,
"No, I'm not a good actor. I just believe in dying honorably. And you should always do a good job of dying under the knife of a great man such as Robin Hood."
Chapter 9. A Frightening Night Among the Spirits. That night, Tom lay in bed waiting for Huck to call for him. When he finally heard the sound of a cat outside his window, Tom quietly climbed out of the window and found Huck waiting for him there with his dead cat. They reached the graveyard in 30 minutes, as it was just outside of the village. The night was very quiet, so even the slightest sound made the boys jump from fear. When they had found the grave of Hoss Williams, it was still too early for the spirits to come, so Tom and Huck sat down under some trees nearby. They waited a while without talking, but Tom started to become frightened by the sounds of the night, so he started to talk, hoping he'd forget about them.
"Huck, I bet that old hoss can hear us here." "Yeah, you're probably right. So you should always be careful about how you talk about dead people."
This made Tom think for a little while about all the things he had said about the dead people he'd known. But he was interrupted by the sound of voices.
"Did you hear that, Huck?"
Huckleberry listened for a moment and said,
"Tom, they're coming. Where can we hide?" "I don't know. Do you think they can see us here?" "Of course. They can see in the dark. They're spirits." "Well, maybe if we don't move, they won't see us." "I'm pretty worried, Tom." "Be quiet. I think they're getting close."
Then something appeared. It looked like someone carrying a light.
"I don't care about my warts any more, Tom. Let's just get out of here."
Tom put his hands together and started to quietly pray.
"Wait, Tom. It's a person. No, it's 3 people. And one of them is old Muff Potter. I can hear his drunken voice. I'm not afraid of him. And I know that other voice, Huck. It's Indian Joe. Now, him I am afraid of. Let's go, Tom."
But it was too late now. The men had already reached the grave, Hoss Williams' grave.
"Here we are, men."
Tom didn't recognize this voice, but he looked around the tree and saw that it was Dr. Robinson. Tom was afraid to breathe for fear that the men might hear him.
Okay, now start digging,
he said. After a short while, the men pulled up Hoss's box from the ground. Potter then spoke to the doctor.
Now we'll carry it away for you for $5 more. If not, then we'll just leave it right here. I've already paid you enough,
the doctor said.
No, you'll pay us more, because it was your father who sent me to jail when I was younger. Your family owes me,
said Indian Joe. The doctor became angry and hit Indian Joe. Muff Potter was so surprised by this, he dropped his knife. Then he started to fight with the doctor. Indian Joe had seen Potter drop his knife, so when the two men started to fight, he picked it up and waited for the right moment to use it on the doctor. The opportunity came when the doctor turned his back on Indian Joe and hit Potter with a board, who fell quickly to the ground. Indian Joe didn't wait. He immediately put the blade of the knife into the doctor's back. The doctor suddenly stopped fighting and fell on top of Potter. Tom and Huck quietly ran away without being seen. Potter was still asleep when Indian Joe put the knife he'd used to kill the doctor in his hand. When he finally woke up, he first saw Indian Joe sitting near him. Then he saw the doctor's body, and lastly, he saw the knife in his own hand. It was covered with blood.
I can't believe you killed him,
said Indian Joe.
What? I didn't kill anyone,
replied Potter, still surprised by what he'd woken up to.
I saw the whole thing, Potter. After he hit you, you used your knife on him. But don't worry, Muff. I won't tell anyone.
Potter started crying.
Thank you, Joe. I knew you were a good friend. Now you've got to get out of here before someone sees you.
Indian Joe watched Muff Potter run away and laughed to himself, saying,
Well, it looks like he was too drunk to remember to take his knife with him.
Chapter 10. The Agreement. Tom and Huck didn't look back the whole time they ran, and they didn't stop running until they reached the village. Then they went into an old empty building to hide for a while.
I can't believe what we just saw. Do you think the doctor's dead, Huck? If he is, then Indian Joe will be hanged.
Tom thought for a moment and said,
But we're the only people who know he did it. Oh, you're right. I didn't think about that. If we tell, Indian Joe may kill us. Well, maybe we won't have to tell. Maybe Muff Potter will. But, Huck, Muff Potter didn't see what happened after the doctor hit him. Tom, we must agree never to tell anyone. Let's write our agreement in blood.
Tom agreed, and with his knife he cut both his and Huckleberry's hands and wrote their agreement on a piece of wood.
Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer promise they will never tell about what they saw, and if they ever tell, they will die immediately.
Then each boy signed in blood, T.S. and H.F. Tom wrote the H and F, since Huckleberry couldn't read or write. They then put the wood in a hole in the wall of the building and said goodbye to each other for the night. The sun was just about to rise when Tom finally arrived home. He had entered through the window as usual and felt safe that his aunt hadn't heard him, but Sid heard him, and as always, he couldn't wait to tell Aunt Polly at breakfast. When Tom joined Sid and his aunt at the breakfast table, Aunt Polly began to cry and complained that he was always making her sad. "No matter how hard I try to make you a good boy, you always do bad things." Tom hated to see his aunt cry. It made him feel terrible about himself. He promised her that he would be good from now on, but his aunt didn't seem to believe him. His day only went worse when he went to school, for the teacher used his stick on both Tom and Joe for missing school the day before. And when Tom sat down in his classroom chair, he found a piece of paper with something wrapped in it waiting for him. He opened it and found the little gold ball he'd given Becky the other day. This was becoming one of the worst days in Tom's life. Chapter 11. Potter's Capture. At 12 o'clock, the teacher told his students that school was closing early for the day. All of the children were surprised and excited by the news, except for Tom. He knew it was because the doctor's body had been found and that the whole village was talking about it now. Tom heard some people saying that the police found Potter's knife next to the body, and someone had said that they'd seen Potter washing himself in the river this morning and that he'd run away when he noticed he was being watched. This surprised most people because Muff never seemed to care about washing himself before today. Tom found many people gathered at the graveyard. He felt uncomfortable there, and he felt even worse when he saw Huckleberry there. They tried not to look at each other for fear that someone might suspect them of knowing something. Then Tom saw Indian Joe. He was surprised to see him at the scene of the crime. A group of policemen soon appeared, and with them they had Muff Potter. Potter looked frightened. When they brought him to the grave where the murder happened, he fell to the ground, crying,
"Please, I'm telling you I didn't do it. I could never kill a man." "No one said you did,"
someone from the crowd said. Potter realized that it was Indian Joe who had spoken.
"But you told me you wouldn't tell, Indian Joe."
The police showed Potter the knife and asked him if it was his. He dropped his head and admitted that it was. He started shaking and looked up at Indian Joe again.
"You know I didn't do it, Indian Joe. You were there. Tell them I didn't do it."
The police asked Indian Joe what he knew. He told them what he saw, and Tom expected God would kill Indian Joe right there for lying, but nothing happened. Tom wanted to tell the truth, but he knew he'd be killed if he did. It bothered Tom that an innocent man was going to be punished and that he couldn't do anything about it. This idea stayed in his mind all week. He couldn't sleep at night, and if he did sleep, he had terrible dreams and he said things out loud. Sid said he'd heard Tom one night saying,
"Blood! Blood! Please don't kill me, please!"
"What's upsetting you, Tom?" asked Aunt Polly. "Something's on your mind and you need to talk about it."
"It's nothing, Auntie."
But Tom's face had turned white when she asked him this question. During this period of time, Tom visited Potter's window at the jail every day and gave him a small gift to try to make him feel better. He wasn't sure if it helped Potter, but certainly helped Tom. Because Indian Joe had been digging up Hoss Williams's grave, most of the people of the village wanted to put him in jail too. But they feared that this would just anger him, and he might, later on, punish those who'd put him in jail a second time. so Indian Joe remained free. Chapter 12. Aunt Polly Studies Medicine. Now Tom had something else to worry about, other than Indian Joe. It seemed that Becky Thatcher had become ill. Tom was afraid that it might be very serious. He became very much unlike himself. He didn't want to do anything except think about Becky. This worried his aunt. She wanted to make him feel better, so she started reading books about keeping healthy. These books offered all kinds of advice, such as what you should and shouldn't eat, drink, and wear. She was so worried about Tom's health that she was willing to try anything and everything the book suggested. So, one morning, she pulled Tom out of bed and took him into the garden and poured cold water over his head. Then she put him back into bed and covered him up with a lot of blankets. This, of course, didn't improve the situation, so she tried other things, like giving him less food and making him stay in bed longer. Then she tried a new medicine called painkiller. When she gave it to Tom, it seemed like she'd started a fire in his mouth. He yelled and jumped up and down. She thought this might be a good thing, so she started to give him painkiller every day. Of course, all of her attempts at helping Tom only made him feel worse. He wished that she would stop trying to make him feel better. He knew that he couldn't continue to take the painkiller anymore. So, when his aunt wasn't looking, he started putting the medicine in a hole in the floor, instead of in his mouth. Now she could give him as much painkiller as she wanted. He even told her that he liked it. This made his aunt very happy. One day, as Tom was putting the painkiller in the hole in the floor, Peter the cat came into his room to visit. Peter became very interested in what Tom was doing. He started to smell the hole in the floor, and it seemed to Tom that he wanted to try the painkiller.
I don't know, Peter. I'm not so sure you'd like this.
Peter didn't seem to believe Tom, because he kept smelling around the hole in the floor.
Well, okay. If you want to try it, I guess I can let you. But don't get angry with me if you don't like it.
So he fed Peter some of the medicine. The cat went absolutely crazy. He screamed loudly and ran all round the room, jumping from bed to chair, to table to dresser, and back to the bed again. Then he jumped to the ground and rolled around on his back like a drunken man. He continued to do this until Aunt Polly came running into the room. Then he jumped to his feet and ran screaming out the window. Tom couldn't stop laughing. This was one of the funniest things he'd seen since the dog in church. Now what is wrong with that cat, Tom?
Oh, he's just excited, Auntie. You know how cats are.
But Tom had forgotten to cover the hole where he put the painkiller, and his aunt saw it now. She quickly became angry and started hitting Tom. You terrible boy! How can you give that to a cat?
I'm sorry, Auntie. I just wanted the cat to feel like someone cared about him, like you cared about me.
What do you mean?
He doesn't have an aunt who gives him medicine that hurts his mouth. So maybe he doesn't feel anyone cares about him.
This made Aunt Polly think for a moment. She suddenly realized how painful the painkiller might be for Tom. She took Tom's hand and said, I'm sorry, Tom. I just wanted you to feel better.
And I was trying to do the same for Peter. It looks like it worked. He was more active a few minutes ago than I've seen him be all year.
All right now, Tom. You be a good boy and get going to school. Tom had been going to school early every day since Becky became ill. Today, as he waited at the front gate, hoping she might come, he saw Jeff Thatcher come walking by the school. Tom became excited, but soon fell back into sadness when he realized that Jeff was alone. He gave up and went inside, feeling terrible. Then, suddenly he noticed out of the corner of his eye, a dress came walking into the classroom, just before the teacher was about to begin. It was Becky. Tom almost jumped out of his seat with excitement. He immediately became his old self again and started playing and joking with the other students. He did his usual tricks to try to get Becky to look at him, but she never did. He did everything he could to get her attention. He stole a boy's hat, walked on his hands again, and finally fell right at Becky's feet. But she just turned and looked the other way, pretending she never saw him. This made Tom's heart weak again. He picked himself up off the ground and, with his head down, slowly walked away. Chapter 13. The Three Pirates. Tom now felt hopeless again. He felt that no one cared about him anymore. He didn't want to be a bad boy. It's just that people gave him no choice. How can someone be good without love? So Tom decided that it wasn't his fault that he was the way he was. It was everyone else's fault. He left the village, imagining that he would never return. After walking quite a long way, he found his good friend, Joe Harper. Joe seemed to be feeling pretty terrible himself. When Tom told him that he was planning on traveling the world looking for new and exciting adventures, Joe said that he had had the same idea. He was angry because his mother had hit him for no reason. He didn't feel that she loved him or wanted him any more, so he ran away. The boys decided that since they had both lost their families, they would have to be a family now. Just the two of them, Tom and Joe, friends and brothers forever. So, now they had to plan what they would do next. After a few moments, they agreed to become pirates. Near the village, at the widest part of the Mississippi River, was a small island about 1 mile wide. Tom and Joe decided to make this their new home. It was totally empty of people and there were lots of trees, so no one would be able to see them from the shore. It was the perfect secret hiding place for pirates. While looking at the island, they met Huckleberry Finn. He didn't have family either, so they asked him if he'd like to become a pirate too. He very happily agreed to join them. They planned to meet at 12 o'clock that night and take a small boat over to the island. This way, no one could see them going there. They were all to bring food and any other useful supplies to help them live on the island. Tom brought some meat, a compass, and his knife with him that evening. He waited for his friends up on a hill above the river. It was a very quiet night, so he started to whistle. Then he heard someone whistle the same song somewhere down the hill. Tom tried whistling again, and someone said,
"Hey, who's that?" "I'm Tom Sawyer, the famous black pirate. And who am I talking to?" "Huck Finn, the red-handed, and Joe Harper, the destroyer of the seas."
These were all names that Tom had found in one of his favorite books.
"Do you know the secret word?" "Blood." "Okay, wait for me. I'm coming down,"
Tom said as he started walking down the hill. Once they were together, they looked at what everyone had brought. Joe had some meat with him, and Huck had brought his tobacco. Seeming happy with this, the black pirate said,
"Okay, men. Now we need something to build a fire with."
They decided to steal some firewood from one of the river boats. This would be pretty easy to do now that most of the workers were in the village. But just in case someone had stayed behind to guard the boat, they were very careful when they went aboard. Once they had the firewood, the pirates then found the little boat that would take them to their island. Tom stood at the front of the boat and gave orders to the other boys.
"Okay, let's go faster now." "All right. A little to the right. Wait. No, a little to the left. Watch out for those rocks up ahead."
At one point, they could see the village they had left forever. Tom was happy to be leaving it, and everyone he ever knew. He thought about his aunt and Becky, and he wished they could see him now, being so brave. A couple of hours later, they landed on the shore of the island. The first thing they did was hide their boat and find a place to keep their food safe from the animals. They decided not to build a shelter for themselves, as they liked the idea of sleeping outside like real pirates. Later that evening, after dinner, they relaxed around a fire. Huck thought this was the perfect opportunity to smoke, so he took out his tobacco and started rolling a cigarette. The other two pirates watched him and wished that they knew how to smoke, and then they could really be like pirates. Huck lay back and began to smoke. After a couple of minutes of silence, he asked,
"So, what exactly do pirates do?"
Tom was the first to answer.
"Well, Huck, they steal treasure from ships and kill the sailors, except for the women. They don't kill women. They steal them along with the treasure if they're pretty. And they wear beautiful clothing from all over the world,"
said Joe. Huck looked at his own clothes.
"My clothing's not very beautiful,"
he said.
"Where can I get some better ones?" "Don't worry, Huck. We'll have plenty of opportunities to find new clothes once we start to travel."
Soon they all became tired, but the only person to really sleep was Huckleberry. The other two pirates were feeling a little guilty about having stolen the meat, the boat, and the firewood. They agreed never to take anything of anybody else's in the future. Chapter 14. Life on the Island. When Tom woke up, he didn't recognize where he was. It took him a few seconds to remember that he and his friends had run away. It was nice waking up outside, among the trees and the animals. Tom could hear the birds, both far and near, talking to each other. One bird, a blue jay, landed on a tree branch near the boys and looked at them curiously. It seemed as though this were the first time it had ever seen human beings before. At the same time, Tom noticed how similar animals and insects were to human beings. Some were busy working, some were eating, and some were playing. This made Tom want to play, so he woke the other boys and they all ran into the river to swim and clean themselves up for the day. While they were playing, they noticed that the river had carried away their boat. But this didn't bother any of them. They had everything they needed. They built another fire, and then Tom and Huck went fishing. Joe was the cook, so he just rested until they returned with the fish. After breakfast, they all rested around the fire, and it was agreed that this had been the best breakfast they'd ever eaten. Once their energy had returned, they wandered around the island for a while and then played some more in the river. At lunchtime, Joe cooked up some meat for everyone, and they sat around the fire talking for a while. They were happy all morning, but once they sat down to rest and the talking stopped, they started to feel differently. They began to think of their homes, and this made them feel a little sad and lonely. But they didn't talk about these feelings with each other, for fear that they'd be laughed at. Then there suddenly came a loud noise from the direction of the village. They all jumped up and ran to the edge of the island to see what it might have been. On their way to the shore, they heard the loud noise again. Through the trees, they could see a riverboat full of people. It was the boat that people used to cross the river every day. But it wasn't being used for that purpose now. It wasn't crossing the river. It was going down the river.
Hey, I think they're looking for someone who's drowned. They're shooting that big gun to try and get the body to rise to the top of the water, just like they did last year when they found Bill Turner's body,"
shouted Huckleberry.
"You're right, Huck. But I think we're the ones they believe to be drowned,"
said Tom. Suddenly, the three boys started to feel great. The village must be terribly sad. Just to see all of those people looking for them on the boat, it made them realize how important they were to their village. All of those sad feelings they'd had a few minutes ago were now forgotten. It was great being a pirate again. When night came, the boats went back to the village, and the boys went back to their fire. They all agreed that this had been a great day. It felt good to be missed. They wondered what the people of the village might be saying about them right now. They talked and laughed a lot, thinking about this. But soon their laughter died down, and they began to think about how this probably wasn't very funny for the people in the village, especially for their families. Then Joe looked up from the fire and said,
"Maybe we should think about going back." "Don't be silly, Joe,"
Tom said, laughing.
"Yeah, don't be silly,"
Huck repeated. Soon both Joe and Huckleberry were sleeping. Tom, however, had other plans. He left a note for both of them, putting one in Joe's hat and the other in his pocket, so he'd find it easily, and then he ran toward the river. Chapter 15. Tom secretly visits home. Earlier that day, Tom had found where the river had carried their boat. It wasn't too far down from where they were staying. It was a little hard to find it this evening, due to the darkness, but now he was pulling it out into the river. As soon as the water started to carry the boat without his help, Tom jumped inside. He let the water take him toward the big river boat that had been looking for them earlier. Once he arrived, he quietly tied his boat to a tree near the shore and then climbed up a rope hanging from the big river boat. As soon as he was on the top floor, he heard the bell ring, indicating that the boat was now heading one last time for his village. He hid in the little boat hanging from the side of the large one, and when the river boat arrived at the village 12 minutes later, Tom climbed back down the rope into the water and swam to the shore. Within minutes, he was back in his aunt's garden, looking through the window into a room where people seemed to be talking. Inside were his Aunt Polly, his brother Sid, Mary, and Joe Harper's mother. They were all talking, but Tom couldn't hear them very clearly. So he went quietly to the front door and entered the house. He was crawling on his hands and knees. "I suddenly feel a little cool. Did someone forget to close the front door?" asked Aunt Polly. "Sid, be a good boy and go and close the door." Hearing Sid coming closer, Tom quickly hid under the table near the door. Luckily, Sid didn't see him. "I know I yelled at Tom a lot," Tom heard his aunt saying, "but he wasn't really a bad child. He just had a lot of energy, like any young child. I don't think he tried to be bad. In fact, I don't know a sweeter boy in the whole world than Tom. And my son Joe was no different. He was always a good boy, too. I was too hard on him. I wish I'd been more kind. Now I'll never get to tell him I'm sorry," cried Joe's mother. Tom could hear his aunt start to cry. "I feel so terrible. Just yesterday I yelled at Tom for something he did to the cat." Tom felt tears coming to his eyes as Aunt Polly told this story to Joe's mother. Everyone in the house was crying now. He was surprised to hear how good a boy he'd been. He wanted to run into the room and give his aunt a big hug. But he stayed where he was and listened some more. It seemed that one of Joe's hats had been found a few miles down the river, so the whole village assumed they'd drowned. There was going to be a prayer service for the boys in church on Sunday. After Joe's mother had left, and Sid and Mary had gone to bed, Tom could hear his aunt praying for him. He loved her more than ever at this moment, because he now knew how much she loved him. He cried again as he listened to her, and she prayed herself to sleep. When he was sure she was sleeping, he carefully walked into her room and looked at her for a while. He felt guilty and wanted to make her feel better. He thought about leaving a note for her so she would find it when she woke up the next day. But then he changed his mind. An idea had suddenly come to him. He kissed his aunt and then started back for the river. He found another small boat tied to the shore and got into it. He took it across the river, close enough so that he could swim to the island. He had wanted to keep the boat, but he realized that people would look for it the following day, so he left it on the shore, hoping they'd think that it just came untied and drifted across the river by itself. He then swam to the island. By the time he arrived, the sun had begun to rise. He walked through the trees for a while until he could hear the boys talking. He heard Joe say to Huckleberry,
"Don't worry. Tom will be back. He wouldn't just forget about us."
Then Tom surprised them by coming from behind a tree and saying,
"That's right, Joe. I could never forget my fellow pirates."
They all made breakfast, and as they ate, Tom told them what he'd seen and heard. Chapter 16. A Difficult Night. Joe was still thinking about returning home. He was feeling worse and worse the longer he was away from home. Huckleberry felt sad as well. Tom realized this and was eager to tell them something that would help them to feel better. However, he wanted to wait for the right moment. He tried to get them to think about something else, so he reminded them they were now pirates.
"I believe other pirates once lived on this island. If that's true, then they probably left some treasure hidden somewhere near here. Why don't we look for it? We could all become rich."
Huck and Joe just sat there looking sad. Then Joe said,
"I just feel too terrible. I'm ready to go back home." "Hey, don't talk like that, Joe. You're just not used to it yet. Let's go fishing. You'll soon forget about it. I don't really want to fish, Tom. I just want to go home. But home is boring, Joe. I don't care anymore. I miss my mother. You're such a child, Joe. Go home then. We don't need you. There's nothing wrong with missing your mother. You just don't know what it's like because you've never had a mother. Huck, you've had a mother before, and you don't seem to miss her much, right?
Huck just looked at the ground. Joe started walking toward the river, and Huck suddenly said,
I kind of agree with Joe, Tom. I may not miss my family, but I miss my old life. Fine. You go, but I'm staying right here.
When Huck began to follow Joe toward the river, Tom felt a pain in his heart. He also wanted to go home, but he wasn't ready to go just yet. He had a plan, and now was the right moment to tell the boys about it.
Okay, wait a minute, boys. There's something I haven't told you.
Tom walked out to where they were standing in the river. They listened to what Tom had to say, ready to keep walking as soon as he had finished, but the more he talked, the less of a hurry they were in to go back home. They liked his plan and agreed to follow it.
Why did you wait so long to tell us about it, Tom?
Later that evening, Tom and Joe asked Huck to teach them how to smoke. So Huck took out his tobacco and paper and taught them first how to make a cigarette, how to light it, and finally, how to smoke it.
Hey, this isn't difficult. I can't believe they don't teach us this when we're younger,
shouted Tom.
Yeah, I agree. I thought that I'd feel sick, but I don't feel anything,
said Joe. Then Tom had an idea.
Listen, Huck. When we go back to the village, you and I will surprise the other kids. One day, when we're all together, I'll ask you for a cigarette, and then you'll say that you didn't bring your good tobacco. And I'll say that if it's strong tobacco, then it's good enough for me. Then you and I will smoke like we've been doing it since we were born. Those kids would really be surprised then. Good idea, Tom. I can't wait to see their faces.
They kept talking for a while, until Joe said that he'd lost his knife. Tom offered to help him find it, and they both walked off together, leaving Huck alone by the fire. After an hour had passed, Huck started to wonder what had happened to the others. He got up and found both of them sleeping under a nearby tree. Later that night, Joe woke up and felt something was strange about the weather. He shouted for the other boys to wake up. Tom and Huck felt that something was strange as well. They built a fire and sat around it, waiting to see what would happen. Then there was a bright light in the sky for only a short moment, and after it came a loud noise. It was the beginning of a storm, and soon it started to rain.
Run, everyone, before we get wet,
Tom shouted. Each boy ran and found his own shelter. It was a strong storm. The wind blew hard and the rain fell heavily. The boys tried shouting to each other, but the sound of the rain made it impossible for them to hear. The boys were frightened as the wind blew several trees on their side, and the light continued to come and go in the sky. Eventually, however, the storm started to calm, and the weather once again became quiet and peaceful. Surprisingly, the boys' fire was still burning. They were too wet to sleep, so they cooked some meat and talked around the fire until morning. After the sun rose, they lay under it to dry themselves until it became too hot. Then they rested under some trees. Lying there, they all thought eagerly about returning home. They were tired of being pirates. They still had one more day on the island, so Tom thought of another game for them to play. They pretended they were Indians. They hunted like Indians, fought like Indians, and, at the end of the day, they smoked together like real Indians. And it was nice for Tom and Joe to realize once again that they had taken another step toward being men by learning how to smoke without feeling ill. Chapter 17. The Boys Come Back from the Dead. The next day was a sad one for the village. It was the day that everyone was to meet at the church and pray for their lost boys. Everyone was so sad that they didn't even talk much to each other, and the children didn't play as they usually did. For Becky Thatcher, this was a truly terrible day. She remembered how she had treated Tom. And as she thought about this, she said to herself, "If only I could see Tom again, I'd tell him how sorry I was and how happy I would be to get engaged again." And then she cried. The day before, many children from the school gathered at the front gate to think and talk about Tom and Joe and all of the games they had played with them, and all of the times those two boys had gotten into trouble. They missed them both terribly. One boy said that he had been the last person to see them alive. The children had many questions for him. This made the boy feel very proud. The church bell rang all morning for the people to remember the boys. At 10 o'clock, everyone came to the church and sat quietly waiting for the prayer service to begin. The last people to enter the church were the families of the dead boys. As Aunt Polly, Sid, Mary, and all of the Harpers walked down the center of the 2 rows of seats, the rest of the people stood up out of respect for them. Once the 2 families were seated in front, the minister began to talk about the boys. He talked about how wonderful they were, which made many people feel guilty for having once thought of them as bad boys. Between prayers, everyone cried. Then, suddenly, at the back of the church, there was the sound of a door being opened slowly. There was total silence inside, and everyone turned to see what was happening. And soon, walking before them all, were the very boys they were there to pray for. Both Tom's and Joe's families came running to greet them with tears of joy. Huck felt a little embarrassed and tried to leave the church, but Tom caught him and said to his aunt,
"It's not very fair that Huck doesn't have anyone to greet him."
Aunt Polly smiled even more, and taking Huckleberry in her arms said, "You can think of Tom's family as your family, Huckleberry." This just made Huck even more embarrassed.
"Oh, what a wonderful day this has turned out to be. Let me hear all of you sing as loud as you can,"
shouted the minister. And so the church was filled with singing voices. Tom even sang, and loudly too. He knew that this would be a day he would always remember. Chapter 18. Tom tells about his amazing dream. So that was the plan Tom had told his 2 friends about on the island. They would go back to their village and secretly listen to everyone talk about them. They had left the island last night and arrived at the village a couple of hours before the prayer service began, so they found a place to sleep in the old empty building where Tom and Huck had made their agreement. For breakfast the next day, Aunt Polly and Mary cooked a lot of food in their excitement to have Tom back. They were all very talkative. "We're lucky to be able to laugh about it now," but I wish you had come and told me sooner where you were. I was crying all day, every day. Why didn't you try to make your aunt feel better sooner, Tom?" "I think that Tom just didn't think about it. He was probably having too much fun." "I'm sure he would have come if he'd thought about it," replied Mary. "Is that true, Tom? Or did you just decide it would be nice to frighten your aunt a little? You know Tom. He's always forgetting to think about people other than himself." "Well, I'm sure that Sid wouldn't have made me suffer like that. He would have told me where he was. I think that in the future, after I've been dead a while, you'll wish you'd been nicer to me, Tom." Tom now felt guilty and said,
"Don't say that, Auntie. I'm sorry I didn't tell you, but you were in my dreams."
"Well, that doesn't exactly make me feel better."
"In my dream, you, Sid, Mary, and Joe's mother were all sitting in that room over there. You were all talking about us."
"Well, actually, we did all meet in there one night. Tell me more, Tom."
"Well, it's hard for me to remember it clearly."
"Try, Tom. Think very carefully."
"I remember that you felt a little cold and sent Sid to close the front door because you thought someone had left it open."
"That's true. Go on."
"Well, you continued talking about us, and I seem to remember you saying that I had really been a good boy before. You said that I just had a lot of energy to use up."
"This is just amazing. How can people say that it's impossible for dreams to really happen when I've just heard it with my own ears?"
Then you started crying.
"You're right again."
And when Mrs. Harper began to cry, you told her the story about what had happened with me and the cat the other day. Then you started talking about how our bodies had been found, and you said something about there being a prayer session at the church on Sunday.
"Well, I don't know what to say, Tom. You have a very special ability."
And after everyone had gone to bed and Mrs. Harper had gone home, you started praying, and I remember it felt like I had been right there in the room with you. Then you fell asleep, and I watched you there for a while, wishing I could do something to make you feel better. I had a note ready to give you. It said, "We're still alive. Don't worry. We've just become pirates." Then, just before leaving, I gave you a kiss.
"Is that true, Tom? Did you really kiss me in your dream?" Aunt Polly asked while giving Tom a big hug.
"It was just a dream, Aunt Polly,"
said Sid. "Shut your mouth, Sid. Here's a nice big apple for you, Tom. Thank you for being such a sweet boy. Now, go on to school." On his way to school, Tom could see that everyone was looking at him. Some children started to follow him, hoping they might get a chance to talk with him. Other children were jealous of Tom's popularity, and they tried to pretend they hadn't seen him. Tom no longer needed Becky Thatcher as his girlfriend. He was famous now, so he could have many other girls if he wanted them. He pretended not to see Becky when he got to the school. Several times he noticed that she would come over near where he was playing to look at him, and then quickly run back to play with other boys. Tom started talking with Amy Lawrence again, hoping Becky would see this and become jealous. This worked well, because Becky became angry, but she didn't tell anyone. And no matter how badly she wanted to get away from Tom, she found that she couldn't. She ran over to one of the other girls and said, "Hey, Mary! I couldn't find you yesterday. I wanted to let you know that I am having a picnic." "Really?" "Yes. My mother said it was okay." "Can I come?" "Of course you can. All of my friends will be there." Becky then looked to see if Tom had heard her saying this, but he was still talking with Amy Lawrence. Soon, all the children started asking to be invited to the picnic. Well, almost all of them. Tom and Amy were still talking. This made Becky even angrier than before. She could feel tears coming to her eyes. She ran away now to try and hide her sadness. Later that day, Tom saw Becky sitting with Alfred Temple. They were reading a book and laughing about something. Tom suddenly no longer wanted Amy Lawrence. He had to have Becky again. Becky now pretended not to see him watching them. She was happy to see him so jealous. Tom stood there watching them, thinking of how he would beat Alfred Temple the next chance he got. He hated everything about him. His clothes, his face, his name, everything. He made 2 fists and started swinging them around, pretending he was hitting Alfred. At lunchtime, Becky sat with Alfred again, hoping Tom would see them, but he never appeared. She quickly became angry and told Alfred, who sat there surprised by this sudden change in her attitude, that she never wanted to see him again. Now Alfred realized that Becky had been using him to make Tom jealous. He decided that he had to do something to hurt Tom. He went into the classroom, picked up one of Tom's books, and tore the pages out of it. Then he put it back on Tom's desk, so that it would look like Tom had destroyed it. At that same moment, Becky had been watching Alfred through the window. She decided not to tell Tom what had happened, because she wanted to see him get into trouble. Chapter 19. The Truth About Tom's Dream. When Tom came home for lunch that same day, he was terribly sad, and what his aunt had to say to him didn't help him to feel any better. "Tom, you're lucky I don't beat you right now."
"Why, Auntie? What's wrong?"
"I visited Mrs. Harper today and was excited to describe your dream to her. When she wasn't amazed by the story, I asked why, and she told me that Joe had said that you'd come back here that night and listened to our conversation. How could you make me look like such a fool, Tom?"
I'm sorry. I should have told you the truth."
"Mary was right when she said that you always think of no one but yourself. You have so many ideas, Tom. Ideas about getting people to do things for you, about running away, and about causing trouble for other people. Sometimes I can't believe that one child can have so many ideas. Why don't you ever have ideas about doing things to help others? Why are your ideas such selfish ideas, Tom?"
"Really, Auntie, I didn't mean to hurt anybody. I really did want to tell you that we were safe the night when I came here and heard you all talking. I wanted to make all of you happy again. It hurt to see everyone crying. But it was so nice to hear you saying such good things about me. Usually, all that anyone says are bad things about me, so I didn't want to stop you."
"I find it hard to believe that you wanted to tell us. I think that you were happy to see us so sad."
"I'm telling the truth, Auntie. I hated to see you that way."
"Well, then you should have said something."
"When I heard you mention Sunday's prayer service, I changed my mind about telling you. I thought it would be better to make everyone happy all at the same time. So I didn't leave that note for you."
"Which note?"
Remember, the one I told you I'd planned to give you in my dream. The one that said that we hadn't died, that we'd just become pirates.
So if that part of your story is true, did you also really kiss me before you left?
Yes, Auntie.
Why did you do that?
Because I felt so terrible for you, and I wanted to show you how much I love you.
Aunt Polly guessed that this was really true. She was so happy to hear him say these words, she asked for another kiss, and then sent him back to school. Once Tom was out of the door, she searched his coat pockets and found the note that he just mentioned. After reading it, she said to herself, "He could do anything now, and I'd forgive him." Chapter 20. Tom loses his selfishness. So, feeling better now, Tom walked back to school. On his way, he saw Becky and ran over to her, saying,
Listen, I'm really sorry for behaving badly this morning. Can't we just forget about it and be good friends?
She didn't slow down, nor did she look at him when she replied, "You and I will never be friends, Thomas Sawyer. Now, leave me alone." Tom just watched her as she walked away. Her anger was making him angry all over again. For a moment, he wished she were a boy so he could hit her. Becky really couldn't wait to see Tom get into trouble for destroying his book. She imagined the teacher beating Tom with his stick, and this made her smile. She didn't realize at the moment that she would soon be in the same kind of trouble as Tom. For the last month, their teacher had been bringing a book with him to the classroom, which he studied whenever he had a break. He always looked very serious when he read it. It seemed he couldn't wait for the next opportunity to read it. The children couldn't help being interested in what the book might be about, but no one had ever been brave enough to look. But this morning, Becky saw the book lying on the teacher's table, and, while the teacher was away, started looking through it. When Tom walked into the room a few minutes later, she tried to put the book down quickly so he wouldn't see. But one page was torn. Now, Becky became terribly frightened and began to cry. "I hate you, Tom Sawyer! It's your fault that I broke the teacher's book. Now he's going to use his stick on me. I've never been beaten before, but you'll see! You're going to be beaten too, and I can't wait to watch." Then she ran outside, crying even harder than before.
Girls are so silly,
thought Tom.
I've been beaten 100 times in school. It's nothing. And why does she think I'd tell the teacher she broke his book? I'd never do that. When the teacher asks the class, he'll know who did it just by looking at her guilty face.
Soon it was time for class to begin. The first thing the teacher noticed was Tom's book. And even though Tom told him that he hadn't torn it himself, the teacher beat him anyway. He didn't feel that he could trust a word that came out of Tom's mouth. As Becky watched the teacher hit Tom, she realized that she didn't feel as happy about it as she had planned. She very nearly shouted out the truth, but stopped herself, knowing that she would be next. Later, during the first break, the teacher immediately picked up his book to read it. At this moment, Becky looked more frightened than a little helpless animal in the forest. Tom felt sorry for her. He didn't want to see her get beaten. Seconds later, the teacher was shouting for the students to tell who had broken his book.
Come now, I know you know who did this.
But no one said a word. The teacher started calling out names and watching the students' faces as they answered. When he shouted out Becky's name, She turned white and couldn't speak. She kept her eyes down toward the table.
Miss Thatcher, answer me. Did you touch my book this morning?
Suddenly, Tom stood up and shouted,
It was me, teacher.
The students couldn't believe what Tom was doing. Did he want to be beaten a second time? Well, if he did want that, he got it. For the teacher took out another stick and started hitting him again. But it didn't matter to Tom. The look of love and thanks on Becky's face made it impossible for him to feel anything the teacher did to him. Chapter 21. Tom and Huck feel guilty. So, summer finally came, and now school was closed for a few months. But surprisingly, Tom didn't feel as happy as he usually did. Becky Thatcher had left town to stay with her family in another village for a while. This made the days seem very long and boring. So Tom had a lot of time to think, and what he thought about most was the memory of Indian Joe killing the doctor in the graveyard. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't get it out of his mind. Soon, Tom fell ill. He stayed in bed for 2 weeks where he could avoid hearing the news from the village. He didn't want to know what was happening. And for 3 more weeks, he would often feel as though he were better, and then, suddenly, he would become ill again. Part of what made Tom feel so bad was that the judge had arrived to hear the people's story about what happened. And soon he would make the final decision about what was to happen to Muff Potter. Everyone in the village was talking about it, and every time Tom heard them, his heart would jump a bit. One day he met Huckleberry in the empty building and asked him,
So, have you said anything to anyone? About what? Come on, you know. Oh, of course not. Not once? Not once. Why do you ask? I just worry a little. You know what would happen to us if we said anything. We'd be dead soon after. What if someone started asking you a lot of questions? Would you tell them? No way. I'm not crazy. Good. I think that we're safe if we don't talk. But we should make another agreement.
So another agreement was made in blood.
What have you heard people saying, Huck? Just Muff Potter, Muff Potter, Muff Potter. It makes me want to hide. I've heard the same thing. You know they're going to hang him. Do you feel sorry for him?
Of course, I feel sorry for him.
He has never hurt anyone. All that he's ever done is getting drunk, but he doesn't ask other people for money. He earns his money by fishing. And I remember one day when he didn't have any money at all. He gave me one of the fish he'd caught. He's a good man who's helped me when I needed it. And he's done the same for me, too. He taught me how to catch fish. There must be something we can do to get him out of jail. Forget it, Tom. There's nothing we can do. And if there was, he'd just be caught again. Yes, I can't stand to hear the way people talk about him now. And he shouldn't be remembered like this after he dies. He's not the killer everyone thinks he is.
Later that evening, the boys went to visit Potter. They had done this before, always going to his window and giving him some of Huck's tobacco and a little something to eat. Potter always appreciated their visits. The boys noticed this, and it made them feel even sadder. Tonight, as they talked, Potter said,
You boys haven't treated me differently since I was put in jail, but everyone else hates me now, even if I'd been friends with them before. All the people I'd tried to help in the past, they've forgotten me. They never come here to see me. You're the only people who have been good to me in these terrible times.
And I want you to know I'll always remember your kindness.
Now, I want to give you some advice, boys. I've done something terrible. I never thought that I could do something like that before, but, well, I guess I was just drunk. But now I'm going to die for what I did. Anyway, I want to tell you this. Don't ever be like me. Don't let drinking control and destroy your life like it has controlled and destroyed mine. I hope you're listening very carefully. I know what I'm talking about. You two boys are good people, and if you do what I tell you, you'll stay good. Can you come here closer so I can see your faces better? Yes, those are the faces of two good boys who've helped old Potter in his times of trouble, and I know that they'd do more if they could. Now, you boys go on home. It's starting to get late.
Tom felt terrible. He couldn't sleep well at all, and he spent the following 2 days sitting outside the courthouse. There, the judge was listening to the village's report about how the murder happened. As much as Tom wanted to go inside to hear what was happening, he wouldn't let himself. Huck was there too, but they tried not to sit with each other or talk at all, so no one would suspect them of knowing something. Whenever Tom heard the people talk about what was happening, the information was always bad. It seemed that Indian Joe had told his story well, and the judge believed it. Tom walked around thinking all day and night. When he returned home, he found himself lying in bed thinking more about Muff Potter and the judge. The next morning, the whole village went to the courthouse because this was to be the day that the judge made his decision. Potter came in looking sad and without hope. Indian Joe sat in the seats with everyone else to watch. He looked very calm. Then the judge came in. 2 men were questioned. One man had seen Potter the morning after the murder washing himself in the river. He said that when Potter had realized someone had seen him, he ran away. The other man talked about finding Potter's knife near the dead doctor's body. Muff Potter's lawyer never asked a single question, which surprised everyone in the courtroom. They all thought,
Why is this man just sitting there listening? He should be trying to help Potter. That's what he's paid to do.
And when more men were questioned, Potter's lawyer still just sat there listening, not saying a single word. Finally, after all of the questions had been asked and stories had been told, Potter's lawyer stood and said to the judge,
Sir, because Muff Potter cannot remember anything about that night, and because none of the people questioned today were actually there when the murder happened, I have decided to bring someone to the courtroom who could remember very clearly what happened. I'd like to bring in Thomas Sawyer.
As Tom stood up and walked to the front of the room, everyone watched him with their eyes wide and their mouths open. During the questioning, Tom looked very frightened. The lawyer began by asking,
Mr. Sawyer, could you tell the courtroom where you were the night that Dr. Robinson was killed?
Tom could see Indian Joe looking directly at him, and he quickly lost his ability to speak. He sat there silent for a moment and finally managed to say,
I was in the graveyard, sir.
Suddenly, everyone in the room started talking to each other. The judge had to ask them to be silent. Indian Joe didn't say anything. He just smiled.
Where were you in the graveyard? Near Hoss Williams' grave, sir. When you say near, what do you mean? I was about as close to the grave as I am close to you now, sir. Was anyone with you? Yes. Okay. You needn't say his name. We may be asking him questions later. Tell us, did you have anything with you there?
Tom looked at the ground without speaking.
Tell the courtroom what you had with you. Remember to tell the truth. We had a dead cat, sir.
The people in the courtroom started laughing so much when they heard this. The judge, once again, had to ask them to be quiet.
We found the bones of this cat, which proves that the boy was there. Now, Mr. Sawyer, tell us what you saw that night.
Tom told his story, and as he did, the people's eyes got wider and wider, and Indian Joe looked more and more angry.
So, when the doctor hit Muff Potter, Indian Joe took the knife he'd picked up and...
Suddenly, from the crowd, a knife came flying at Tom's head. Luckily, it missed him and flew into the wall, almost cutting Tom's ear. And then Indian Joe was running to the window, hitting anyone who tried to stop him. When he reached the window, he jumped out and ran into the forest. Chapter 22. Tom becomes a hero. So everyone in the village was again talking about Tom. People, both young and old, respected him more and more. The village newspaper wrote a story about him, and this impressed people even more. Some thought him great enough to one day become the American president. So Muff Potter was now free again, and everyone treated him like they had before he'd been arrested. He seemed to forgive most of the people for hating him so much while he was in jail. Even though these were exciting days for Tom, he was still very frightened about Indian Joe. And Huck was also afraid. Although he was happy for Muff Potter, he was angry with Tom for breaking their agreement. He worried that some people might know that he'd been there too. But most of all, he feared that Indian Joe knew. And no one knew where Indian Joe was hiding. Chapter 23. Tom and Huck Hunt for Treasure. Every boy at some time in his life feels the desire to look for hidden treasure. Hidden treasure that once belonged to pirates. Tom now had this desire. When he looked for his friends, none of them seemed to be around. They were somewhere playing or fishing. But then Tom found Huckleberry, and even though he'd been angry with Tom, the thought of finding a lot of money made him very happy. So he agreed to help Tom.
So we'll have to look for the money on islands or under trees, or maybe even under the floors of old houses where spirits of people who used to live are. Why would the money be there?
Asked Huckleberry.
Because that's where thieves usually put their money. Sometimes they forget about it or they die, and the money just sits there. I know a house that would be good to look in, and there are lots of old trees around it. How will we know which tree to look under? We'll just look under them all.
After gathering some gardening tools, they walked out of the village to the house Tom had mentioned. Before beginning their work, they sat under a tree and relaxed for a while, because it was a hot day and Huck wanted to smoke. Tom looked at Huck and said,
"What do you plan to do with the money?" "I plan to spend it before my father takes it from me and spends it on drinks. What about you?" "I'm going to marry someone." "You're crazy to want to get married. Married people fight all the time." "Not my wife. She'll be very sweet." "No, women are all the same, Tom. Who is this girl you want to marry?" "I can't tell you." Well, I don't want you to get married. I won't have anyone to play with. Why don't you just move in with my wife and me, Huck?
Then they started to work. And when, after 1 hour, they'd found nothing, Huck said,
Are you sure this is right? Do you think they'd put it so far under the ground? This may not be the right place.
They started working under a different tree, but after a while, Huck got tired again.
This doesn't seem right either. Can we try another place, Tom? We could try that old house behind Mrs. Douglas's home up on Cardiff Hill. Yes, but won't she take the money from us? If we find the money, it's ours. She couldn't take it from us. Well, let's work a bit more and see if we find anything first.
After working a while longer, Tom stopped and said,
I just remembered something, Huck. We must look for the shadow of an old tree in the moonlight. The money will be under the ground in that place.
So the boys went home for a while and met again later that evening. They started working again once they'd found the shadow of the tree. They worked hard and dug deep into the ground, but they found only rocks. Finally, Tom said,
Huck, we're wrong again. But we're digging where the shadow was. Maybe we started at the wrong time. We should give up,
Huck said.
We can't just keep guessing about the right time and place, and I don't like digging out here at night. It frightens me. I'm frightened too, Huck. The thieves almost always put a spirit with the treasure to protect it. Really? Sure they do. Tom, I don't like dead people, and they probably don't like us. Let's get out of here. I agree. Let's go to that house I mentioned to you before. Where? Near Mrs. Douglas's home. But, Tom, we just agreed not to work where dead people were. Right. So we'll go there in the daytime. The spirits sleep during the daytime. Oh, okay. We can go if you want to, but I don't like the idea.
Chapter 24. The Old House on Cardiff Hill. The boys met at the dead tree on Saturday, and again, before starting work, they sat under the tree and relaxed for a while. When they got up to enter the old house, they found that they felt more frightened than they thought they would in the daytime. It was such a lonely, quiet, and old home. Looking inside the door, they saw a dirty floor and everything covered in dust. They walked slowly and silently through the front entrance, listening carefully for the slightest sound that might mean something was in there waiting for them. But the house remained quiet and they became less afraid, so they started to look around. They looked around every room, and once they'd finished with the first floor, they walked upstairs to the second. They didn't find anything and were going to return to the first floor when Tom suddenly turned to Huckleberry and said,
What was that? What? I didn't hear anything. There it is again. Do you hear it? Oh, my God, Tom, I hear it. Let's hide. If we hide now, they'll hear us. See, they're right at the front door.
Through a hole in the floor, the boys saw two men enter the room below. They recognized one of them from their village. He looked old and had long, white hair. People knew him as the man who couldn't speak or hear. The other man they didn't seem to know. He wore old clothing and looked very unfriendly. As they sat down on the ground, the unfriendly-looking one said,
I'm very worried that we'll be caught. I think we should change our plan.
And suddenly, the man who they believed couldn't hear or speak spoke.
You're just afraid.
Then the boys became even more frightened when they recognized the man's voice. It was Indian Joe. He continued speaking.
Relax. They didn't catch us before. Well, things were different then. I'm afraid they may find us here. I'd planned to leave yesterday, but those two boys might have seen us. You remember, we saw them playing on Cardiff Hill.
The boys heard this and started to shake even more. They were lucky they hadn't come to this house the day before. But now they wished they hadn't come at all. The two men got out some food they'd brought with them and started eating. Then Indian Joe spoke.
All right, here's the plan. You go back home after the sun goes down. Stay there until I come for you. Then we'll do one final job and run away. I'm going to rest now. Why don't you stay awake and watch for anyone who might come looking around here?
But soon both men were sleeping.
Okay, Huck, this is our chance to get out of here. Sorry, Tom, I can't. I'm afraid they'll hear us and... Fine, I'll go by myself.
But when he started to move, the floors made too much noise, and he stopped immediately, fearing he might have already woken the men up. But luckily, they were still asleep. Just as night was beginning, Indian Joe woke up and shook the other man awake.
Hey, we've got to get going soon. Where do you think we should keep the money? I can't carry $600 around with me everywhere. Let's bury it.
Then he got on his feet and went over to a place in the room where there were several large rocks on the floor. He lifted one of them and from underneath took what looked like a bag of money. Seeing the money, the boys suddenly forgot about the danger of their situation. This was the kind of treasure they'd been looking for. It didn't matter that it was Indian Joe's treasure. Then Indian Joe took out his knife and began to dig a hole in one of the corners of the room. The boys gave each other a look that seemed to mean,
How lucky we are to have come here today.
Then there was the sound of Indian Joe's knife hitting something hard.
Hey, look at this,
he said.
What?
Asked the other.
Why don't you help me here? Wait. No, I've got it. It seems to be a box.
Indian Joe pulled the box out of the hole and opened it.
Hey, there's money here. It's gold.
Just then the other man came running over to Joe to see what exactly had been found.
There must be several thousands of dollars here,
said Indian Joe.
That's great. Now we don't have to do that job in the village,
said the other. Indian Joe looked at him seriously and said,
I don't care about the money we'd get for doing that job. I just want to hurt the people who put me in jail before. Now, if you're going to help me, you need to go home and wait until I come and get you. But what about this money? Do you want to bury it again? Yes. Wait. Maybe not.
Indian Joe suddenly stopped when he saw the boys' gardening tools in the room.
Where did those come from? That dirt on them looks kind of new. I think someone's been here. We'll have to put the money in the special hiding place under the cross.
Then Indian Joe stood up again and looked out all of the windows.
Whoever put these tools here may still be here. They may be in the room above us.
Then he picked up his knife and started walking toward the stairs. The boys didn't know what to do. They thought that this would be the last minute of their lives. With each step Indian Joe took on the stairs, the boys felt more and more afraid. But then came the sound of wood breaking, and through the hole in the floor, The boys saw Joe fall to the ground.
"Damned old house,"
he said, getting back on his feet.
"No one could have walked up there. I guess they must have seen us and quickly left."
The men gathered the gold and put it into the bag with the rest of their money and left the house. The boys just stayed where they were until the men were far away. They didn't even speak while they waited for the right moment to go back downstairs. They were afraid, but they wanted that money, so they agreed to find Indian Joe when he returned to the village, and then they'd follow him to the secret hiding place he'd mentioned. Tom wondered whom it was that Indian Joe wanted to hurt. He wasn't sure if it was he or someone else. He would find out soon. Chapter 25. Was it all just a dream? Tom had difficult dreams that night. All he could think about was the money. Each time he dreamed that the money was his, and he imagined himself spending it in all kinds of ways. Buying a new house for his aunt, buying himself a nice boat, and so on. But with each dream, disappointment followed, because he would wake up and find himself the same young man whose most valuable possession was a gold ball, which the girl he loved didn't want. Tom had never seen so much money before. It was almost unbelievable to him that someone could have found that much money in his village. Then he began to doubt that any of it had been real at all. He thought that maybe the whole thing had been a dream. Early next morning, Tom went looking for Huckleberry. When he found him, he planned not to say anything about the money. If Huckleberry didn't mention it, then Tom would know it had all just been a dream. He found him at the river, sitting on the side of a boat, looking sad.
"Hello, Huck." "Hello."
Huck was silent for a moment, and then he said,
"We were so stupid to leave our tools down in that room. We could have found that money instead of Indian Joe. Wow, it wasn't a dream." "Dream? No way. If those stairs hadn't broken when Indian Joe was walking up them, we wouldn't be here today. Huck, we have to find him. We have to get that money. I remember them saying something about number 2 when they were talking about the secret hiding place. It could be the number of a house or something. But none of the houses in this village have numbers. Well, maybe it's a room number in one of the public houses for travelers." "You may be right, Tom. This village only has 2 of those." "Wait for me here, Huck. I'll be right back."
A half-hour later, Tom returned. He'd asked about room number 2 in both public houses and found out that in one of them there lived a young man whom everybody knew, but no one was sure who lived in the other public house. One man said that, the night before, he had seen a light in the window there.
"That must be Indian Joe's room, Huck." "Yes, it must be. So what's our plan, Tom?" "Well, we still have to make sure that it's Indian Joe's room. If you see him sometime in the next day or 2, follow him. If he doesn't go there, it must not be his room. If it is his room, I think we should be able to easily get in at night, because the entrance is around the back and no one will see us." "I don't want to follow him by myself, Tom." "Well, you know he won't come to the village until dark, so he probably won't see you. I promise you that I'll follow him if I see him. You have to be strong if you want to find that money, Huck."
Chapter 26. The Public House. 3 nights later, the boys waited until dark and then went to the public house. There wasn't anyone around when they got there. Everything had been closed about an hour earlier. They went around back, to where the door for room number 2 was. The plan was for Huck to be the guard while Tom went inside to look around. They silently approached the door. Tom turned the handle and, with a little bit of trouble, he managed to open the door. He went in and Huck stayed outside as planned. He waited for Tom for what seemed to be a very long time. He started to fear that something had happened to him. He began to fear that Tom would never come back out. But then the door suddenly opened and Tom ran out without turning around to look at Huck. He just yelled out,
"Run! Run! As fast as you can!"
So they ran and they didn't stop running until they had arrived at the opposite end of the village, where their usual hiding place, the old empty building, was.
"I was so frightened, Huck. You remember when I tried opening the door but couldn't? Well, then it was suddenly very easy to open. I didn't know why. I walked in and soon felt something under my foot. I looked down and saw that it was Indian Joe's hand." "No way." "I'm telling the truth. He was totally drunk and must have been going to open the door when he heard me trying to get in, and then I guess he fell asleep while doing it. Lucky for me. So, did you see where that box was?"
What? Are you joking?
"I just turned and ran. I didn't get to see anything, Huck." "If he's drunk, we should be able to get that box easily, Tom." "Okay, then you go and get it from his room. I'm not going near there."
Huckleberry thought about it for a moment, but then said,
"No way. Listen, Huck, wait until we know that Indian Joe is not in there. Then we can go fast and get that box. We'll just wait until he's not in his room, then we'll go and get the money. Sure, I'll watch the room and then let you know when they're gone. Okay, you know what to do. Come to my window and make a noise like a cat."
Chapter 27. Becky's Picnic. The next day, Tom heard something that made him forget all about Indian Joe and the money. He heard that Becky Thatcher had returned home. What was even better was the news that she was going to have her picnic the next day, which meant that Tom could see her very soon. Early the next day, all of Becky's friends gathered at her home, ready to begin the picnic. Then they all walked down to the river to get on the riverboat that would take them to the park where the picnic would be held. Poor Sid had become ill, so he stayed home and was looked after by Mary. Before Becky left her home, her mother said to her, "Since you're going to be out so late today, why don't you just stay at one of your friends' homes near the river? You can just come back home tomorrow." "Okay, I'll stay at Susie Harper's." "Okay, she's a nice girl. Now, you be careful today." Once the boat arrived at the park, all of the children ran off it and immediately started playing in the forest. They ran about and shouted and laughed for a couple of hours until they started to get hungry. Then they all gathered near the boat and began to eat the food they'd brought with them. And once they'd finished eating, they relaxed for a while under the trees. After a while, someone shouted,
"Let's go to the caves."
Everyone jumped to their feet and gathered lights and sweaters in preparation, for it would be cold and dark inside. When they got to the cave entrance, they found that a door had been placed there, but it was wide open for some reason. Inside were cold rock walls with water dripping from them. The cave was very long and had many different paths and rooms. No one knew just how far it went. The further you walked, the more rooms and paths you found. Usually, people didn't go too far into it for fear that they might get lost and die from hunger and cold. Most of the children walked for about a mile before turning around and meeting again at the entrance. When they had all come back to the entrance, they were surprised to see that the sun had almost gone down, and they could hear the boat's bell ringing, which meant that it was time for everyone to return. While Huckleberry sat in the dark waiting for Indian Joe to leave, he could see the river boat returning to the shore. The sun had now almost completely gone down. Everyone was now returning home for bed. It was 11 o'clock and still no one had left room number 2. Huck found that he couldn't stay awake, so he was about to let himself fall asleep when suddenly he heard something. He looked up and saw 2 men walking past his hiding place. One of them was carrying a box. He thought for a moment about what he should do. He wanted to run and tell Tom, but if he did that, he might not be able to find these men again. So he decided to follow them. He followed them as they walked toward the river and then turned and headed up Cardiff Hill. After they'd passed Old Man Jones's home, they reached the top of the hill and hid among the trees. Huck silently waited behind one of the trees near the men and listened.
All right, I see some lights on inside Mrs. Douglas's house. It looks like someone might be there visiting her,
he heard one of the men say.
Lights? What lights? I don't see anything,
said the other man. Huckleberry suddenly realized that Indian Joe planned to hurt Mrs. Douglas. This was the job that he'd mentioned in the old house the other day. Huckleberry remembered how kind a woman Mrs. Douglas was, and he started to feel frightened for her. Would they beat her? Would they kill her? He wanted to warn her, but he knew that they'd just kill them both if he tried. Then Indian Joe spoke.
If you look from where I'm standing, you can see the lights. I see them now. Let's forget it and run away. Shut your mouth. Don't you remember what I said before? I'm going to hurt her because her husband put me in jail before. Now that he's dead, I can't hurt him, so I'm going after his wife. Don't kill her, Joe. I don't plan to. I'm just going to cut her face a bit and make her horrible to look at. If you don't help me, I will kill you. And if I kill you, I guess that I can just go ahead and kill her too. Okay. Let's just get this over with. We can't go yet. We'll wait until the lights are out.
This gave Huckleberry some time to try and find help. So he started to run back toward the village. Since Old Man Jones's house was closest, Huck went there first. He hit the door with his fists until Mr. Jones answered with his 2 big sons standing behind him.
Who are you, and what in the hell are you doing knocking on my door at this late hour? Please, sir, I'm Huckleberry Finn. Quick, let me in before they see us. Huckleberry Finn? What kind of name is that? What do you want? Sir, Mrs. Douglas is in terrible trouble. She's a good woman. I don't want anything to happen to her, but you have to promise not to tell anyone I told you, or I might be killed. All right, boy. Tell us what's wrong.
As soon as Huckleberry finished his story, Mr. Jones and his 2 sons were walking toward Mrs. Douglas's home with guns in their hands. Huckleberry was too afraid to follow them the whole way. He hid behind a rock and just waited. Then he heard the guns being fired and a loud cry. He jumped to his feet and ran away as fast as he could without looking back. Chapter 28 Old Man Jones's Story. The next morning, Sunday morning, Huckleberry returned to Mr. Jones's home and knocked softly.
"Well, it's Huckleberry Finn again. Come on in, boy."
It was strange for Huckleberry to hear someone be so nice to him. Once he entered the home, Mr. Jones said to him,
"We were hoping you'd come back last night. When the sun finishes rising, we'll all sit down to a nice hot breakfast. I'm sorry that I disappeared last night. I heard the guns and became frightened. I ran as far and as fast as I could. I came back now to find out what happened, and I didn't wait until sunrise because I feared those two men might see me. Well, I'm sorry to tell you that they're still alive. They saw us and then ran. After that, we went to get some of our friends in the village to help look for them. We've got people looking down by the river and out in the forest. My sons and I are going to join them after breakfast. I just wish that we knew what they looked like. Do you know? Well, one of them has long white hair, and most people think that he can't hear or speak, but he really can."
After he'd described the other man's face and clothing, Mr. Jones's two sons left the house to tell the others what the men looked like while the information was still clear in their minds. When Mr. Jones asked Huckleberry why he'd been following those two men, he told him that one of them was Indian Joe, so he had known that they were going to do something bad. He didn't mention the money at all. Huck stayed at Mr. Jones's during this period of time for safety. When people began coming to the house, Huck hid from them. Mrs. Douglas came over to thank Mr. Jones for chasing those men away.
"Actually, it's not me you should thank. I wouldn't have known anything if someone else hadn't told me. But I can't tell you who he is. He doesn't want you to know."
Everyone was talking about the two men the next day at church. As they left the church, Mrs. Thatcher said to Mrs. Harper, "Those children must have really had fun yesterday. I can't believe Becky and Susie are still sleeping at your home." "You mean Becky, your daughter?" "Yes. She told me that she was going to stay at your home last night." "She did stay there, didn't she?" "No." Suddenly, Mrs. Thatcher stopped, her eyes filled with water. And at that moment, Aunt Polly joined them, saying, "Good morning, ladies. Mrs. Harper, Tom didn't come home last night. I assume that he just stayed at your home, and he didn't come to church this morning for fear that I'd be angry." "No, he didn't come to our home." She, too, had turned white now. They called Joe Harper over to them and asked him when he last had seen Tom and Becky, but he couldn't remember. Soon, everybody at the church knew that Tom and Becky were missing. All of the children who'd gone to the picnic were asked if they'd seen them on the boat, but no one remembered because it had been dark. Then one of them said that it was possible that they might still be inside the cave. Mrs. Thatcher and Aunt Polly both began to cry. And within 30 minutes, every man in the village was searching for the missing children. The women of the town gathered together to try to comfort Aunt Polly and Mrs. Thatcher. They all cried together while waiting for news from the men. But all that came was a message saying,
"We'll be needing more food and lights."
When Old Man Jones returned home from looking for the children, he found that Huck was ill. Mrs. Douglas, when she heard the news that Huck was feeling bad, came to care for him. Soon, many of the men were too tired to look any further, but some of the stronger men kept looking. They went deep inside the cave to places they'd never known were there before. They shouted for the children to answer and shot their guns in the air for them to hear, but no reply ever came. One man found Becky and Tom written on one of the walls. After 3 days, there was still no word of anyone having found the children. Chapter 29. Tom and Becky in the Cave. At first, Tom and Becky had walked with the other children around the rooms of the cave, but soon they'd become tired of playing with them, and so they decided to walk to other parts on their own. When they found a little waterfall, Tom walked behind it and held his light there so Becky could see the water clearly. But while he was behind the waterfall, Tom found a hole that led to another part of the cave he'd never seen before. When he told Becky about this, she seemed interested, so he put a mark on the wall to help them find their way back, and they started down into the hole. As they walked, Tom kept making marks on the wall. Soon they found themselves in a large room with bats hanging from the ceiling. As soon as they entered, the bats started flying about, screaming. Tom and Becky ran into a smaller room to get away. In here was a small pool of water. Sitting by the pool, they started to realize just how quiet the cave had become. Becky said, "I haven't heard any of the other children for a while now."
We're pretty far below them now, so we shouldn't be able to hear them.
"Do you think we can find our way back, Tom?"
I think so, but I don't want to see those bats again. Let's try another way.
"Okay, but let's not get lost." As they started to walk again, they didn't seem to recognize any of the rooms they entered. Becky became very frightened and started crying. Tom shouted, but there was no reply. The quiet made Becky even more frightened, and even Tom now became afraid. "Let's just go back through the room full of bats. If we keep going this way, we'll just get lost." But Tom said,
I'm so stupid, Becky. Ever since we started walking again, I haven't made any marks on the walls.
"Oh no, Tom! We're lost. We're going to die in this horrible cave. We should never have left the others." She fell to the floor, crying loudly. Tom sat down next to her and hugged her, trying to calm her down. He apologized to her for not being more careful, but she admitted that it was just as much her fault as it was his. They began walking again, and as they did, they talked about their friends, school, their families, and the sunlight. They started to walk again. Each had a light. Now they decided to use only one light and to save the other. Becky cried so much that she soon became tired and laid down to sleep for a while. Once she had finally fallen asleep and stopped crying, Tom started to feel a little better. An hour later, when she woke up, Tom saw that she was going to cry again, but before she did, he said to her,
Don't worry. I'm going to get you out of this cave. Just follow me.
Though she started walking again with Tom, she didn't really believe that he would succeed in finding the way out. After another hour had passed, Becky said, "Tom, I wish we had something to eat." Luckily, Tom had put some cake in his pocket earlier at the picnic. He broke it in half and gave one piece to her. Tom took Becky's hand after she'd finished eating and said to her,
Now, I don't want you to worry too much, but we're almost out of light, so we should stay here by the water.
Becky began to cry again, but suddenly stopped to say, "Surely the village people will look for us. Maybe they're looking right now as we speak."
Of course, when your mother realizes you haven't come home, she'll have everyone looking for you."
Becky started crying again. "Oh, Tom, she won't notice anything for at least another day, because I was supposed to stay at the Harpers after the picnic." And just after she had said this, their light went out, and they both sat crying in the quiet darkness. After a while, they both fell asleep. When they awoke, they realized that they now were losing track of time. Not only did they not know the hour, but also they didn't even know which day it was. Tom guessed that it was Sunday. Becky didn't even try to guess. She just sat in the darkness as if she were waiting to die. Soon they were hungry again. Tom took some of the small crumbs of cake that remained in his pocket and gave half to Becky. As they ate, a shout was suddenly heard from far away. Tom jumped to his feet and started shouting back. Then there was another distant shout. Tom pulled Becky up and they began trying to walk toward the shouting. But soon they found that they couldn't walk any further because the path ended. If they hadn't been careful, they could have fallen down the edge of the rock to their deaths. Now the shouting started to move farther and farther away until it could no longer be heard. Sadly, they returned to the pool of water and waited, hoping other shouts would be heard. They slept again, and when they woke up, they found that they were again very hungry. Tom decided to look around a bit. He thought that just sitting there and waiting for someone to find them was a bad idea. He took some string from his pocket and tied one end of it around a rock near the pool. Then, with the other end of the string in one hand and Becky's hand in the other, he started to explore the area. A few minutes later, Tom found a hole in the floor. He then lay down and tried looking through the hole. But as soon as he put his head down inside, he immediately saw a hand appear just next to his face. The hand was carrying a light, and behind the hand suddenly appeared the face of Indian Joe. Tom didn't move. He just stared straight ahead with his eyes as wide as they could get. Luckily, Indian Joe was equally frightened by seeing someone, so he ran away. Tom got back on his feet and pretended that he hadn't seen anything special. He suggested that they return to the pool and rest for a while. Later on, after he had calmed down from his encounter with Indian Joe, Tom wanted to start looking around again. But Becky was weak now from hunger. She asked Tom to promise to come back after he'd looked and hold her a while before she died. Tom kissed her and promised that he would. Then he got to his feet and with the string in his hand began again his search for a way out. Chapter 30. Tom is again a hero. After 2 more days had gone by, most of the people of the village had given up on finding the 2 children. Both Mrs. Thatcher and Aunt Polly were in terrible condition and did nothing but cry day and night. But one night, at around 3 o'clock, the church bells started ringing. Everyone quickly dressed and met in the street. Down by the river, shouting could be heard.
"The children are found!"
Aunt Polly couldn't believe her ears. The whole village gathered to hear Tom tell his story.
"So I walked as far as the string could go, trying every path I could find, but every time I came to a wall. But at the end of the 4th path, just as I was about to try another direction, I saw a light far away in the distance. So I put the string down and ran to it. When I got there, I found a hole in the cave, and when I put my head through it, I found that I was outside again. And just below me was the river. When I went back to get Becky, she thought I was joking and wanted me to leave her alone to die. but I kept pulling at her, and eventually she got up and followed me out.
When the children ran down to the river, there was a boat passing by, so they shouted.
The men told us we were 5 miles away from the cave entrance. We couldn't believe how far we had walked.
It took 3 days of rest for the children to return to their normal health. When Tom found out about Huckleberry's illness, he went to see him over at Mrs. Douglas's home. There, he was told not to mention his adventure to Huckleberry, because he was still too weak to be excited. Old Man Jones told Tom that Indian Joe's partner had been found dead in the river. He probably hadn't been a good swimmer and drowned while trying to run away. Tom visited Becky Thatcher's home 2 weeks later and was told by her father that the entrance to that cave was now completely covered, so that no one would ever be able to explore it again. Tom's eyes suddenly widened and he shouted,
"But, sir, Indian Joe is inside."
Chapter 31. Back to the cave. The judge immediately had people working to open the iron door he had placed over the cave entrance. When they were finally successful in opening it, they found Indian Joe lying on the ground just inside, dead. Tom felt a little sad to see him that way, but at the same time, he was no longer afraid. The following morning, Tom and Huck met each other to talk. Huck told Tom about what happened with Indian Joe and his partner after he'd followed them up Cardiff Hill.
"And I heard gunfire, and I heard the next day from Old Man Jones that the 2 men had gotten away. Now we'll never find that money. I think I know where it is, Huck. It must be in the cave." "Huck,"
Tom said,
"that money was never in number 2. It's in the cave." "Are you sure?" "Pretty sure. Why don't we go and look? Do you have enough strength now?" "If it's too deep inside, I won't be able to go with you." "Don't worry. I know a secret way to get there. We'll go through the hole I used to escape from the cave." "Can we go now, Tom?" "Okay, let's just get a little bit of food, some tobacco, some string, and a couple of lights, and we'll be ready."
So, at noon, they took the boat of a friend downriver to the place where Tom had exited the cave. Tom went in first, after tying a string to a rock outside the cave. Coming to the little pool where he and Becky had waited without hope, Tom told Huckleberry how frightening it had been to be so lost. When they found the hole in the floor where Tom had seen Indian Joe, they shone their lights down inside and found a hill leading to another rock below.
"Okay, now look over there on that large rock. What do you see?" "Hey, it's a cross. Remember what we heard them say? The number 2 place was under the cross." "I'm pretty frightened, Tom. Maybe we should just leave." "What? And leave the money?" "Tom, Indian Joe's spirit must be down here." "But Huck, he died 5 miles away from this spot, near the entrance." "But you know what spirits do. They always guard their treasure."
Tom thought for a moment.
"Wait a minute, Huck. He was a bad man. His spirit wouldn't go near a cross." "Hey, you're right."
Huck agreed.
"Okay, let's go and get that money, Tom."
When they reached the bottom of the hill, they found the place where Indian Joe had been sleeping. There was not money to be seen, however. But then Tom took out his knife and went behind the rock with the cross on it, and not long after he started digging, his knife struck wood.
"Hey, Huck, did you hear that noise?"
Together, they dug further until they were able to easily pull the box from the ground.
"Look there, Under the box, Tom.
There were 2 guns.
You know what this means, Tom. It means we're wealthy now. I always knew we'd find this money. And here it is. It's all ours.
They emptied the box and put everything in 2 bags and started walking back toward the exit.
What about the guns, Tom? We can get those later. I'm too hungry to worry about that now.
When they returned to the outside again, they got out their food and ate. And when they finished eating, Huckleberry took some tobacco from his pocket for an after-dinner smoke.
Huck,
said Tom,
we'll take the money to Mrs. Douglas's house. I know a place near there to put it tonight. Tomorrow morning, we can count it and divide it, and then we can find a place in the forest where it will be safe. You wait here now and watch it. I'm going to get Benny Taylor's little wagon.
Within minutes, Tom returned, pulling the wagon behind him. As they were passing Mr. Jones's home, he came out the door yelling,
Who's there? It's just Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer, sir. You boys come with me now. Everyone's been waiting for you. I'll take that wagon. You don't have to pull it yourself. It looks really heavy. What's in it? I'm sure it's filled with dirt or something of no value. Now, let's move a little faster. You've got people waiting. People waiting, sir?
The boys asked.
You'll find out soon.
They walked to Mrs. Douglas's house and entered the front door. Inside were all of their closest friends, Aunt Polly, Sid and Mary, the Thatchers, and the Harpers. They were all wearing their best clothing, while Tom and Huckleberry had dirt all over their clothes and faces. Aunt Polly seemed to be embarrassed by the boys' appearance. Noticing this, Mrs. Douglas took the boys into the bathroom and gave them some new clothing to put on after they'd washed up. "Come and join us at the dinner table when you're all finished," she said, shutting the door behind her. Chapter 32. A Dinner Full of Surprises. Huck ran to the bathroom window and raised it, saying,
Here, Tom, we can escape through here. Why? I don't like being around people, Tom, you know that. Don't worry about it, Huck. They've made a nice dinner for us. It'd be terrible for us to disappear again.
Then Sid came into the bathroom.
So, tell us, Sid, why are all of these people here? Oh, Old Man Jones says that he has surprising news for everyone. But actually, we all know what he's going to say. It'll be no surprise at all. Well, we don't know. What is it?
Asked Tom.
He thinks that Mrs. Douglas doesn't know about Huck following those 2 men that night. So he's going to tell the story at dinner, but she already knew. Well, I can imagine who told her. You've never been able to keep a secret since the day you were born. Now, get out of here. You've ruined the excitement for everyone tonight.
A little while later, Tom and Huck joined everyone at the dinner table. When everyone had finished eating, Mr. Jones rose to say something. He told the story about Huck, and everyone pretended to be surprised. Mrs. Douglas couldn't thank Huckleberry enough. This, of course, made him terribly embarrassed. She continued by saying that from now on, since Huckleberry didn't have a family, she would take care of him. He could live with her, and after he had finished school, she would give him money so that he could go into business for himself. Hearing this, Tom said,
Oh, don't worry about Huck. He's a wealthy man now.
Everyone at the table looked confused.
Really? Huck is rich now. I can prove it. Just wait here and I'll be back."
Then Tom went running out the door. Aunt Polly's face turned red with embarrassment again. "What is that boy doing now?" she thought to herself. When Tom came back in, he was carrying the 2 heavy bags of money. He put them on the table and opened them, saying,
"See, I told you he was rich, and so am I."
The room was completely silent for a whole minute as everyone stared at the money, not believing what they were seeing. Then the judge spoke.
"Tom, can you tell us where you got all of this money?"
So Tom told them the whole story, and afterward they all counted the gold and silver together. It came to almost $13,000. Even though there was a room full of adults, none of them, not even the judge, could say they had ever seen that much money at one time before. Chapter 33. Tom Sawyer's Club. For a long time after that, people were talking about Tom and Huck's money. Now everyone wanted to look for hidden treasure, and they all came to Tom and Huck for advice. Everywhere around the village, they looked under old houses and under the shadows of trees. Wherever Tom and Huck suggested there might be money, they looked. After putting their money in the bank, both boys had enough money to pay for their schooling, food, and clothing for many years to come. Tom was more popular than ever in the village. And ever since the day Judge Thatcher met Tom in Sunday school, his respect for him had become greater and greater. He was proud of him for having saved his daughter. He believed that Tom would one day become a truly great man. But for Huck Finn, life had become difficult. He was terribly sad because Mrs. Douglas had made him move in with her, and ever since then he had been eating well, dressing well, and was going to school and to church. For 3 weeks he had to live like this, but then he decided that he'd had enough, and he ran away. The whole village looked for him. Many feared that he drowned in the river, but Tom knew where he was. He got up early one morning and went to their favorite hiding place in the old empty building. Huck was sitting inside, smoking. His clothes were torn and his face and hair were covered in dirt.
"Huck, you really ought to go back to Mrs. Douglas's home." "Please, Tom, don't mention it. It was horrible living that way. Getting up early, washing myself every single day, both morning and night. I had to sleep in a bed. She made me wear those nice clothes that were just too uncomfortable for me. And the worst thing of all was having to wear shoes on Sunday for church." "But, Huck, that's how everyone lives these days." "Well, Tom, I'm not like everyone else. I like to smoke, but she won't let me. I don't like to pray, but she makes me do it. I don't like to go to school, and what does she do? She makes me go. I like my life the way it is now. And you know what? You can have all of my money, Tom. I don't want it. The more money I have, the sadder I become. Just occasionally give me a few cents so that I can buy some bread or something. Could you just go and tell Mrs. Douglas all this so she won't worry about me any more?" "Now, Huck, she's not going to accept that. I'm sure that if you just be patient and try living with her a little longer, you'll start to like that kind of life." "Oh, sure. I'd love it about as much as I'd love to fall out of a tree and break my neck. No way, Tom. I like being poor, and that's the way I'm going to stay. Besides, We can't enjoy ourselves like we did before. Just because you have money and a good home doesn't mean we can't play like we used to. I hadn't mentioned this to you yet, but I might as well now. I'm starting a boys' club, but only people who go to school and wear nice clothes can join. Really, that's not a very nice thing to say to me. Nice or not nice, Huck, if you want to join Tom Sawyer's club, you're going to have to live your life differently. I want you to join, but I can't let you if you live this way.
Huck thought about it for a moment and then said,
Okay, you've got me.
I'll go back to Mrs. Douglas's and try again.
But only if you let me join your club. No problem, Huck. Now, let's go. We'll talk with Mrs. Douglas when we get back and see if she can be a little less difficult with you. Thanks, Tom. So when's the first club meeting? And what will we do there? Maybe we'll meet tonight. I think we should all agree to take care of each other when one of us needs to be taken care of, and to fight, maybe even kill, anyone who tries to hurt one of our club members. That sounds good, Tom. And we'll all sign the agreement with our blood in this old empty building. Wow, Tom, it sounds like our life is going to be even more exciting than it has ever been. Who cares about being a pirate when you can be a member of Tom Sawyer's club? We'll be famous, and everyone in the village will want to join.
In conclusion, and now this story must end, because this has been a story about a boy, and to tell it any further would mean to have to tell the story of a man. Almost everyone you've read about here is still living happily in that village on the Mississippi River today. It's possible that there may be more to tell you in the future. So, it would be best to stop here for now.